The house was fairly comfortable, and the man appeared to be intelligent and the wife hard-working, but the police reports are very bad. There are several convictions against the former. He has consequently been idle, and the burden of the family has rested on the wife. There are 6 children. 2 of them are working and earning a little, but a large amount of charity from school, church, and private generosity keeps the family going. The children are fearfully verminous. There is a suggestion that some baby farming is done, so many are about. Eldest child anemic, glands, head badly crusted, lice very bad. Second child numerous glands, head covered with crusts, lice very bad. 4 have died. Housing, 8 in 2 rooms. Evidence from police, teacher, church, parish sister, and factor. Case 200. The home is wretched and practically without furniture. The parents were married at ages 17 and 18. 1 child died, and their mode of life has been reckless, if not worse. The present means of subsistence cannot be ascertained, as the man is idle. However, he recently joined the Salvation Army and signed the pledge. The child at school is helped with food and clothes. The girl is very badly bitten, lice and fleas, hair nets. Housing, 4 in 1 room. Evidence from church, school charity, cooperative, employer, parish sister, police, and schoolmistress. Total of children still living, 39. Total of children dead, 27. Need I go on? They are all after this fashion, 800 of them. And if you turn from the congested town to the wholesome, simple country, here is the sort of home you have. This passage is a cutting from the Daily News of January the 1st, 1907, and its assertions have never been contradicted. It fills one with the mildest enthusiasm for the return of our degenerate townsmen back to the land. I came upon it as I read that morning's paper after drafting this chapter. Our attention has been called to a sordid Herefordshire tragedy recently revealed at an inquest on a child aged 1 and 9 months, who died in Woolbley Workhouse of pneumonia. She entered the institution emaciated to half the proper weight of her age and with a broken arm, till then undiscovered, that the doctors found to be of about 3 weeks' standing. Her mother was shown to be in an advanced stage of consumption. 1 child had died at the age of 7 months, and 7 now remain. The father, whose work consists in tending 89 head of cattle and 10 pigs, is in receipt of 11 shillings a week, 3 pints of skim milk a day, and a cottage that has been condemned by the sanitary inspector and described as having no bedroom windows. We are not surprised to learn that the coroner, before taking the verdict, asked the house surgeon who gave evidence whether he could say that death was accelerated by anything. Our wonder is that the reply was in the negative. The cottage is in the possession of the farmer who employs the man, but his landlord is said to be liable for repairs. That landlord is a clergyman of the Church of England, a J.P., a preserver of game, and owner of 3,000 or 4,000 acres of land. And here again is the Times, by no means a socialist organ, generalizing from official statements. Houses unfit for human habitation, rooms destitute of light and ventilation, overcrowding in rural cottages, contaminated water supplies, accumulations of every description of filth and refuse, a total absence of drainage, a reign of unbelievable dirt in milk shops and slaughterhouses, a total neglect of bylaws, and an inadequate supervision by officials who are frequently incompetent. Such, in a general way, is the picture that is commonly presented in the reports of inquiries in certain rural districts made by medical officers of the local government board. And even of such homes as this there is an insufficiency. In 1891 to 1895, more than a quarter of the deaths in London occurred in workhouses and other charitable institutions. See Note 9. Now suppose the modern socialist did want to destroy the home. Suppose that some socialists have in the past really wanted to do so. Remember that is the reality they wanted to destroy. Note 9. Studies Scientific and Social, Volume 2, Chapter 24, by Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace, Macmillan & Co., 1900. But does the modern socialist want to destroy the home? Rather, I hold, he wants to save it from a destruction that is even now going on, to, I won't say, restore it, because I have very grave doubts if the world has ever yet held a high percentage of good homes, but raise it to the level of its better realizations of happiness and security. And it is not only I say this, but all my fellow socialists say it too. Read, for example, that admirable paper, Economic and Social Justice, in Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace's Studies Scientific and Social, and you will have the clearest statement of the attitude of a representative modern socialist to this question. Part 2. The reader must get out of his head the idea that the present system maintains the home and social purity. In London at the present time, there are thousands of prostitutes. In Paris, in Berlin, in every great city of Europe or America, thousands. In the whole of Christendom, there cannot be less than 1 million of these ultimate instances of our civilization. They are the logical extremity of a civilization based on cash payments. Each of these women represents a smashed and ruined home and wasted possibilities of honor, service, and love. Each one is so much sheer waste. For the food they consume, their clothing, their lodging, they render back nothing to the community as a whole, and only a gross, dishonoring satisfaction to their casual employers. And don't imagine they are inferior women, that there has been any selection of the unfit in their sterilization. They are, one may see for oneself, well above the average in physical vigor, in spirit, and beauty. Few of them have come freely to their trade, the most unnatural in the world. Few of them have anything but shame and loathing for their life, and most of them must needs face their calling fortified by drinks and drugs. For virtuous people do not begin to understand the things they endure. But it pays to be a prostitute. It does not pay to be a mother and a homemaker, and the gist of the present system of individual property is that a thing must pay to exist. So much for one aspect of our present system of a world of homes. Consider next the great army of employed men and women, shop assistants, clerks, and so forth, living in, milliners, typists, teachers, servants who have practically no prospect whatever of marrying and experiencing those domestic blisses the socialist is supposed to want to rob of them. They are involuntary monks and nuns, celibate not from any high or religious motive, but through economic hardship. Consider all that amount of pent-up, thwarted, or perverted emotional possibility, the sheer irrational waste of life implied. We have glanced at the reality of the family among the poor. What is it among the rich? Does the wealthy mother of the upper middle class or upper class really sit among her teeming children, teaching them in an atmosphere of love and domestic exaltation? As a matter of fact, she is a conspicuously devoted woman if she gives them an hour a day. The rest of the time they spend with nurse or governess, and when they are 10 or 11, off they go to board at the preparatory school. Whenever I find among my press cuttings some particularly scathing denunciation of socialists as home destroyers, as people who want to snatch the tender child from the weeping mother to immure it in some terrible wholesale institution, I am apt to walk out into my garden, from which 3 boarding schools for little children of the prosperous classes are visible, and rub my eyes, and renew that sight, and marvel at my kind. Consider now, with these things in mind, the real drift of the first main socialist proposition, and compare its tendencies with these contemporary conditions. Socialism regards parentage under proper safeguards and good auspices as not only a duty but a service to the state. That is to say, it proposes to pay for good parentage, in other words, to endow the home. Socialism comes not to destroy, but to save. And how will the endowment be done? Very probably it will be found that the most convenient and best method of doing this will be to subsidize the mother, who is, or should be, the principal person concerned in this affair, for her children, to assist her, not as a charity, but as a right in the period before the birth of her anticipated child, and afterwards to provide her with support for that child so long as it is kept clean, in a tolerable home, in good health, well taught, and properly clad. It will say to the sound mothering woman, not typewriting, nor shirt sewing, nor charring is your business, these children are. Neglect them, ill-treat them, prove incompetent, and your mother right will cease, and we shall take them away from you and do what we can for them. Love them, serve them, and through them, the state and you will serve yourself. Is that destroying the home? Is it not rather the rescue of the home from economic destruction? Certain restrictions, it is true, upon our present way of doing things would follow almost necessarily from the adoption of these methods. It is manifest that no intelligent state would willingly endow the homes of hopelessly diseased parents, of imbecile fathers or mothers, of obstinately criminal persons or people incapable of education. It is evident, too, that the state would not tolerate chance fatherhood, that it would insist very emphatically upon marriage and the purity of the home, much more emphatically than we do now. Such a case as the one numbered 197, a beautiful instance of the sweet old-fashioned, homely, simple life of the poor we socialists are supposed to be vainly endeavouring to undermine, would certainly be dealt with in a drastic and conclusive spirit. Part 3. So far, socialism goes towards regenerating the family and sustaining the home. But let there be no ambiguity on one point. It will be manifest that while it would reinvigorate and confirm the home, it does quite decidedly tend to destroy what has hitherto been the most typical form of the family throughout the world, that is to say, the family which is in effect the private property of the father, the patriarchal family. The tradition of the family in which we are still living, we must remember, has developed from a former state in which man owned the wife or child as completely as he owned horse or hut. He was the family's irresponsible owner. Socialism seeks to make him and his wife its jointly responsible heads. Until quite recently, the husband might beat his wife and put all sorts of physical constraint upon her. He might starve her or turn her out of doors. Her property was his, her earrings were his, her children were his. Under certain circumstances, it was generally recognized he might kill her. Today, we live in a world that has faltered from the rigors of this position, but still clings to its sentimental consequences. The wife nowadays is a sort of pampered and protected half-property. If she leaves her husband for another man, it is regarded not as a public offence on her part, but as a sort of mitigated theft on the part of the latter, entitling the former to damages. Politically, she doesn't exist. The husband sees to all that. But on the other hand, he mustn't drive her by physical force, but only by the moral pressure of disagreeable behavior. Nor has he the same large powers of violence over her children that once he had. He may beat within limits. He may dictate their education so far as his religious eccentricities go, and be generous or meagre with the supplies. He may use his authority as a vague power far on into their adult life if he is a forcible character. But it is at its best a shorn splendour he retains. He has ceased to be an autocrat and become a constitutional monarch. The state, sustained by the growing reasonableness of the world, intervenes more and more between him and the wife and children who were once powerless in his hands. The socialist would end that old legal predominance altogether. The woman, he declares, must be as important and responsible a citizen in the state as the man. She must cease to be in any sense or degree private property. The man must desist from tyrannizing in the nursery and do his proper work in the world. So far, therefore, as the family is a name for a private property in a group of related human beings, vesting in one of them, the head of the family, socialism repudiates it altogether as unjust and uncivilized. But so far as the family is a grouping of children with their parents, with the support and consent and approval of the whole community, socialism advocates it, would make it for the first time, so far as a very large moiety of our population is concerned, a possible and efficient thing. Moreover, as the present writer has pointed out elsewhere, see Note 10, this putting of the home upon a public basis destroys its autonomy. Just as the socialist and all who have the cause of civilization at heart would substitute for the inefficient, wasteful, irresponsible, unqualified, private adventure school that did such infinite injury to middle-class education in Great Britain during the Victorian period, a public school, publicly and richly endowed, and responsible and controlled, so the socialist would put an end to the uncivilized go-as-you-please of the private adventure family. Socialism, in fact, is the state family. The old family of the private individual must vanish before it, just as the old waterworks of private enterprise or the old gas company. See Note 11. To anyone not idiotic, nor blind with a passionate desire to lie about socialism, the meaning of this passage is perfectly plain. Socialism seeks to broaden the basis of the family and to make the once irresponsible parent responsible to the state for its welfare. Socialism creates parental responsibility. Note 10. Socialism and the Family. A.C. Fifield, 6d. Note 11. Socialism and the Family. Part 4. And here we may give a few words to certain questions that are in reality outside the scope of socialists altogether, special questions involving the most subtle ethical and psychological decisions. Upon them, socialists are as widely divergent as people who are not socialists, and socialism as a whole presents nothing but an open mind. They are questions that would be equally open to discussion in relation to an individualist state or to any sort of state. Certain religious organizations have given clear and imperative answers to some or all of these questions, and so far as the reader is a member of such an organization, he may rest assured that socialism, as an authoritative whole, has nothing to say for or against his convictions. This cannot be made too plain by socialists, nor too frequently repeated by them. A very large part of the so-called arguments against them arise out of deliberate misinterpretations and misconceptions of some alleged socialist position in these indifferent matters. I refer more particularly to the numerous problems in private morality and social organization arising from sexual conduct. May a man love one woman only in his life, or more? And may a woman love only one man? Should marriage be an irrevocable life union or not? Is sterile physical love possible, permissible, moral, honourable, or intolerable? Upon all these matters, individual socialists, like most other people, have their doubts and convictions. But it is no more just to saddle all socialism with their private utterances and actions upon these issues than it would be to declare that the Roman Catholic Communion is hostile to beauty, because worshippers coming and going have knocked the noses off the figures on the bronze doors of the Church of San Zeno at Verona, or that Christianity involves the cultivation of private vermin, because of the condition of St. Thomas à Becket's hair shirt. See Note 12. To argue in that way is to give up one's birthright as a reasonable being. Note 12. The haircloth encased the whole body down to the knees, the hair drawers, as well as the rest of the dress, being covered on the outside with white linen so as to escape observation, and the whole so fastened together as to admit of being readily taken off for his daily scourgings, of which yesterday's proportion was still apparent in the stripes on his body. Such austerity had hitherto been unknown to English saints, and the marvel was increased by the sight, to our notions so revolting, of the innumerable vermin with which the haircloth abounded, boiling over with them, as one account describes it, like water in the simmering cauldron. At the dreadful sight all the enthusiasm of the previous night revived with double ardour. They looked at each other in silent wonder, then exclaimed, See what a true monk he was, and we knew it not, and burst into alternate fits of weeping and laughter, between the sorrow of having lost such a head and the joy of having found such a saint. Historical Memorials of Canterbury, by the Reverend Arthur Penryn Stanley, D.D. Upon certain points, modern socialism is emphatic. Women and children must not be dealt with as private property, women must be citizens equally with men, children must not be casually born, their parents must be known and worthy. That is to say, there must be deliberation in begetting children, marriage under conditions. And there socialism stops. Socialism has not even worked out what are the reasonable conditions of a state marriage contract, and it would be ridiculous to pretend it had. This is not a defect in socialism particularly, but a defect in human knowledge. At countless points in the tangle of questions involved, the facts are not clearly known. Socialism does not present any theory whatever about the duration of marriage, whether, as among the Roman Catholics, it should be absolutely for life, or, as some hold, forever, or as among the various divorce-permitting Protestant bodies, until this or that eventuality, or even as Mr. George Meredith suggested some years ago, for a term of 10 years. In these matters, socialism does not decide, and it is quite reasonable to argue that socialism need not decide. Socialism maintains an attitude of neutrality, and the practical effect of an attitude of neutrality is to leave things as they are at present. The state is not urgently concerned with these questions. So long as a marriage contract provides for the health and sanity of the contracting parties, and for their proper behaviour so far as their offspring is concerned, and for so long as their offspring need it, the demands of the community as the guardian of the children are satisfied. That certainly would be the minimum marriage, the state marriage, and I, for my own part, would exact nothing more in the legal contract. But a number of more representative socialists than I are for a legally compulsory life marriage. Some, but they are mostly of the older, less definite social democratic teaching, are for a looser tie. Let us clearly understand that we are here talking of the legal marriage only, the state's share. We are not talking of what people will do, but of how much they are to be made to do. A vast amount of stupid confusion arises from forgetting that. What was needed more than that minimum I have specified would be provided. I believe it always has been provided hitherto, even to excess, by custom, religion, social influence, public opinion. For it may not be altogether superfluous to remind the reader how little of our present moral code is ruled by law. We have in England, it is true, certain laws prescribing the conditions of the marriage contract, penalties of a quite ferocious kind to prevent bigamy, and a few quite trivial disabilities put upon those illegitimately born. But there is no legal compulsion upon anyone to marry now, and far less legal restriction upon irregular and careless parentage than would be put in any scientifically organized socialism. Do let us get it out of our heads that monogamy is enforced by law at the present time. It is not. You are only forbidden to enter into normal marriage with more than one person. If a man of means chooses to have as many concubines as King Solomon and live with them all openly, the law, I am speaking of Great Britain, will do nothing to prevent him. If he chooses to go through any sort of nuptial ceremony, provided it does not simulate a legal marriage, with some or all of them, he may. And to anyone who evades the legal marriage bond, there is a vast range of betrayal and baseness as open as anything can be. Free love is open to anyone who chooses to practice it today. The real controlling force in these matters is social influence, public opinion, a sort of conscience and feeling for the judgment of others that is part of the normal human equipment. And the same motives and considerations that keep people's lives pure and discreet now will be all more freely in operation under socialism, when money will count for less and reputation for more than they do now. Modern socialism is a project to change the organization of living and the circle of human ideas, but it is no sort of scheme to attempt the impossible, to change human nature, and to destroy the social sensitiveness of man. I do not deny the intense human interest of these open questions, the imperative need there is to get to the truth, whether one considers it to be one's own truth or the universal truth upon them. But my point is that they are to be discussed apart from socialist theory, and that anyhow they have nothing to do with socialist politics. It is no doubt interesting to discuss the benefits of vaccination and the justice and policy of its public compulsion, to debate whether one should eat meat or confine oneself to a vegetable dietary, whether the overhead or the slot system is preferable for tramway traction, whether steamboats are needed on the Thames in winter, and whether it is wiser to use metal or paper for money. But none of these things have anything to do with the principles of socialism. Nor need we decide whether Whistler, Raphael, or Carpaccio has left us the most satisfying beauty, or which was the greater musician, Wagner, Scarlatti, or Beethoven, nor pronounce on the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy in any prescribed way because we accept socialism. Coming to graver matters, there are ardent theologians who would create an absolute antagonism between socialism and Christianity, who would tie up socialism with some extraordinary doctrine of predestination or deny the possibility of a Christian being a socialist or a socialist being a Christian. But these are matters on different planes. In a sense, socialism is a religion. To me it is a religion, in the sense that it gives a work to do that is not self-seeking, that it determines one in 1,000 indecisions, that it supplies that imperative craving of so many human souls, a devotion. But I do not see why a believer in any of the accepted creeds of Christianity, from the Apostles' Creed upward, should not also wholeheartedly give himself to this great work of social reconstruction. To believe in a real and personal heaven is surely not to deny earth with its tragedy, its sorrows, its splendid possibilities. It is simply to believe a little more concretely that I do. That is all. To assert the brotherhood of man under God seems to me to lead logically to a repudiation of the severities of private ownership, that is, to socialism. When the rich young man was told to give up his property to follow Christ, when the disciples were told to leave father and mother, it seems to me ridiculous to present Christianity as opposed to the self-abnegation of the two main generalizations of socialism, that relating to property in things and that relating to property in persons. It is true that the Church of Rome has taken the deplorable step of forbidding socialism, or at least socialismus, to its adherents. But there is no need for socialists to commit a reciprocal stupidity. Let us socialists at any rate keep our intellectual partitions up. The Church that now quarrels with socialism once quarrelled with astronomy and geology, and astronomers and geologists went on with their own business. Both religion and astronomy are still alive and in the same world together. And the Vatican Observatory, by the by, is honourably distinguished for its excellent stellar photographs. Perhaps, after all, the Church does not mean by socialism socialism as it is understood in English. Perhaps it simply means the dogmatically anti-Christian socialism of the continental type. I am not advocating indifference to any interest I have here set aside as irrelevant to socialism. Men have discussed, and will, I hope, continue to discuss, such questions as I have instanced with passionate zeal. But socialism need not be entangled by their decisions. We can go on our road to socialism. We can get to socialism, to the civilized state, whichever answer is given to any of these questions, great or small. Chapter 7. Would modern socialism abolish all property? Part 1. Having in the previous chapter cleared up a considerable mass of misconception and possibility of misrepresentation about the attitude of socialism to the home, let us now devote a little more attention to the current theory of property and say just exactly where modern socialism stands in that matter. The plain fact of the case is that socialism, whether he wanted to or no, would no more be able to abolish personal property altogether than he would be able to abolish the human liver. The extension of one's personality to things outside oneself is indeed as natural and instinctive a thing as eating. But because the liver is necessary and inevitable, there is no reason why it should be enlarged to uncomfortable proportions. And because eating is an unconquerable instinct, there is no excuse for repletion. The position of the modern socialist is that the contemporary idea of personal property is enormously exaggerated and improperly extended to things that ought not to be private. Not that it is not a socially most useful and desirable idea within its legitimate range. There can be no doubt that many of those older writers who were socialists before socialism, Plato for instance, and Sir Thomas More, did very roundly abolish private property altogether. They were extreme communists, and so were many of the earlier socialists. In More's Utopia, doors might not be fastened, they stood open, one hadn't even a private room. These earlier writers wished to insist upon the need of self-abnegation in the ideal state, and to startle and confound they insisted overmuch. The early Christians, one gathers, were almost completely communistic, and that interesting experiment in Christian socialism, of a rather unorthodox type of Christianity, the American Oneida community, was successfully communistic in every respect for many years. But the modern socialist is not a communist. The modern socialist, making his scheme of social reconstruction for the whole world and for every type of character, recognizes the entire impracticability of such dreams, recognizing too, it may be, the sacrifice of human personality and distinction such ideas involve. The word property one must remember, is a slightly evasive word. Absolute property hardly exists, absolute, that is to say, in the sense of unlimited right of disposal. Almost all property is incomplete and relative. A man under our present laws has no absolute property even in his own life. He is restrained from suicide and punishment if he attempted it. He may not go offensively filthy nor indecently clad. There are limits to his free use of his body. The owner of a house, of land, of a factory is subject to all sorts of limitations, building regulations for example, and so is the owner of horse or dog. Nor again is any property exempt from taxation. Even now, property is a limited thing, and it is well to bear that much in mind. It can be defined as something one may do what one likes with, subject only to this or that specific restriction, and at any time, it would seem, the state is at least legally entitled to increase the quantity and modify the nature of the restriction. The extremist private property is limited to a certain sanity and humanity in its use. In that sense, every adult nowadays has private property in his or her own person, in clothes, in such personal implements as hand tools, as a bicycle, as a cricket bat or golf sticks. In quite the same sense, would he have it under socialism so far as these self-same things go? The sense of property in such things is almost instinctive. My little boys of 5 and 3 have the keenest sense of mine, and, almost if not quite so vividly, thine in the matter of toys and garments. The disposition of modern socialism is certainly no more to override these natural tendencies than it is to fly in the face of human nature in regard to the home. And again, modern socialism has no designs upon the money in a man's pocket. It is quite true that the earlier and extreme socialist theorists did in their communism find no use for money, but I do not think there are any representative socialists now who do not agree that the state must pay and receive in money, that money is indispensable to human freedom. The featurelessness of money, its universal convertibility, gives human beings a latitude of choice and self-expression in its spending that is inconceivable without its use. All such property socialism will ungrudgingly sustain, and it will equally sustain property in books and objects of aesthetic satisfaction, in furnishings, in the apartments or dwelling house a man or woman occupies, and in their household implements. It will sustain far more property than the average working-class man has today. Nor will it prevent savings or accumulations, if men do not choose to expend their earnings, nor need it interfere with lending. How far it will permit or countenance usury is another question altogether. There will no doubt remain, after all the workaday needs of the world have been met by a scientific public organization of the general property in nature, a great number of businesses and enterprises and new and doubtful experiments outside the range of legitimate state activity. In these, interested and prosperous people will embark their surplus money as shareholders in a limited liability company, making partnership profits or losses in an entirely proper manner. But whether there should be debentures and mortgages or preference shares, or such like manipulatory distinctions, or interest in any shape or form, I am inclined to doubt. A money-lender should share risk as well as profit. That is surely the moral law in lending that forbids usury. He should not be allowed to bleed a failing business with his inexorable percentage and so eat up the ordinary shareholder or partner, any more than the landlord should be allowed to eat up the failing tenant for rent. That was once the teaching of Christianity, and I do not know enough of the history or spiritual development of the Catholic Church to tell when she became what she now appears to be, the champion of the rent-exacting landlord and the usurer against socialism. It is the present teaching of socialism. If usury obtains at all under the socialist state, if inexorable repayments are to be made in certain cases, it will, I conceive, be a state monopoly. The state will be the sole banker for every hoard and every enterprise, just as it will be the universal landlord and the universal fire and accident and old age insurance office. In money matters, as in public service and administration, it will stand for the species, the permanent thing behind every individual accident and adventure. Posthumous property, that is to say the power to bequeath and the right to inherit things, will also persist in a mitigated state under socialism. There is no reason whatever why it should not do so. There is a strong natural sentiment in favour of the institution of heirlooms, for example, one feels a son might well own, though he should certainly not sell, the intimate things his father desires to leave him. The pride of descent is an honourable one, the love for one's blood. And I hope that 1,000 years from now some descendant will still treasure an obsolete weapon here, a picture there, or a piece of faint and faded needlework from our days and the days before our own. One may hate inherited privileges and still respect a family tree. Widows and widowers, again, have clearly a kind of natural property in the goods they have shared with the dead. In the home, in the garden close, in the musical instruments and books and pleasant home-like things. Now, in 9 cases out of 10, we do in effect bundle the widow out. She remains nominally owner of the former home, but she has to let it furnished or sell it, to go and live in a boarding house or an exiguous flat. Even perhaps a proportion of accumulated money may reasonably go to friend or kin. It is a question of public utility. Socialism has done with absolute propositions in all such things, and views these problems now as questions of detail, matters for fine discriminations. We want to be quit of pedantry. All that property which is an enlargement of personality, the modern socialist seeks to preserve. It is that exaggerated property that gives power over the food and needs of one's fellow creatures. Property and inheritance in land, in industrial machinery, in the homes of others, and in the usurer's grip upon others, that he seeks to destroy. The more doctrinaire socialists will tell you they do not object to property for use and consumption, but only to property in the means of production. But I do not choose to resort to over-precise definitions. The general intention is clear enough. The particular instance requires particular application. But it is just because we modern socialists want everyone to have play for choice and individual expression in all these realities of property that we object to this monstrous property of a comparatively small body of individuals expropriating the world. Part 2. I am inclined to think, but here I speak beyond the text of contemporary socialist literature, that in certain directions socialism, while destroying property, will introduce a compensatory element by creating rights. For example, socialism will certainly destroy all private property in land and in natural material and accumulated industrial resources. It will be the universal landlord and the universal capitalist. But that does not mean that we shall all be the state's tenants at will. There can be little doubt that the socialist state will recognize the rights of the improving occupier and the beneficial hirer. It is manifestly in accordance both with justice and public policy that a man who takes a piece of land and creates a value on it, by making a vineyard, let us say, is entitled to security of tenure, is to be dispossessed only in exceptional circumstances and with ample atonement. If a man who takes an agricultural or horticultural holding comes to feel that there he will toil and there later he will rest upon his labours, I do not think a rational socialism will war against this passion for the vine and fig tree. If it absolutely refuses the idea of freehold, it will certainly not repudiate leasehold. I think the state may prove a far more generous and sentimental landlord in many things than any private person. In another correlated direction, too, socialism is quite reconcilable with a finer quality of property than our landowner-ridden Britain allows to any but the smallest minority. I mean property in the house one occupies. If I may indulge in a quite unauthorized speculation, I am inclined to think there may be two collateral methods of home building in the future. For many people, always there will need to be houses to which they may come and go for longer and shorter tenancies, and which they will in no manner own. Nowadays, such people are housed in the exploits of the jerry builder. All England is unsightly with their meagre pretentious villas and miserable cottages and tenement houses. Such homes in the socialist future will certainly be supplied by the local authority, but they will be fair, decent houses by good architects, fitted to be clean and lit, airy and convenient, the homes of civilized people, sightly things altogether in a generous and orderly world. But in addition, there will be the prosperous private person with a taste that way, building himself a home as a leaseholder under the public landlord. For him, too, there will be a considerable measure of property, a measure of property that might even extend to a right, if not of bequest, then at any rate of indicating a preference among his possible successors in the occupying tenancy. Then there is a whole field of proprietary sensations in relation to official duties and responsibilities. Men who have done good work in any field are not to be lightly torn from it. A medical officer of health who has done well in his district, a teacher who has taught a generation of a town, a man who has made a public garden, have a moral lien upon their work for all their lives. They do not get it under our present conditions. I know that it will be quite easy to say all this is a question of administration and detail. It is. But it is nevertheless important to state it clearly here, to make it evident that the coming of socialism involves no destruction of this sort of identification of a man with the things he does. This identification that is so natural and desirable, that this living and legitimate sense of property will if anything be encouraged and its claims strengthened under socialism. Today, that particularly living sort of property sense is often altogether disregarded. Every day one hears of men who have worked up departments in businesses, men who have created values for employers, men who have put their lives into an industrial machine, being flung aside because their usefulness is over, or out of personal pique, or to make way for favourites, for the employer's son or cousin, or what not, without any sort of appeal or compensation. Ownership is autocracy. At the best, it is latent injustice in all such matters of employment. Then again, consider the case of the artist and the inventor who are too often forced by poverty now to sell their early inventions for the barest immediate subsistence. Speculators secure these initial efforts, sometimes to find them worthless, sometimes to discover in them the sources of enormous wealth. In no matter, it is more difficult to estimate value than in the case of creative work. Few geniuses are immediately recognized, and the history of art, literature, and invention is full of Chattertons and Savages who perished before recognition came, and of Dickenses who sold themselves unwisely. Consider the immense social benefit if the Creator even now possessed an inalienable right to share in the appreciation of his work. Under socialism, it would for all his life be his, and the world's, and controllable by him. He would be free to add, to modify, to repeat. In all these respects, modern socialism tends to create and confirm property and rights, the property of the user, the rights of the creator. It is quite. Other property it tends to destroy. The property, the claim, of the creditor, the mortgagee, the landlord, the usurer, the forestaller, gambling speculator, monopolizer, and absentee. In very truth, socialism would destroy no property at all, but only that sham property that, like some wizard-cast illusion, robs us all. Part 3. And now we are discussing the socialist attitude towards property. It may well be to consider a little group of objections that are often made in anti-socialist tracts. I refer more particularly to a certain hard case, the hard case of the savings of the virtuous small man. The reader, if he is at all familiar with this branch of controversial literature, probably knows how that distressing case is put. One is presented with a poor man of inconceivable industry, goodness, and virtue. He has worked, he has saved. At last, for the security of his old age, he holds a few shares in a business, a bit of land, or, perhaps through a building society, house property. Would we, the anti-socialist chokes with emotion, so alter the world as to rob him of that? The anti-socialist gathers himself together with an effort and goes on to a still more touching thought. The widow. See Note 13. Note 13. The ethical case for slavery in the southern states of America, my friend Mr. Graham Wallace reminds me, was largely argued on the instance of the widow, with a few strong slaves. Well, I think there are assurances in the previous section to disabuse the reader's mind a little in this matter. This solicitude for the saving small man and for the widow and orphan seems to me one of the least honest of all the anti-socialist arguments. The man who has saved a few pounds, the poor widow woman and her children clinging to some scrap of freehold are thrust forward to defend the harvest of the landlord and the financier. Let us look at the facts of the case and see how this present economic system of ours really does treat the stocking of the poor. In the first place, it does not guarantee to the small investor any security for his little hoard at all. He comes into the world of investment ill-informed, credulous, or only unintelligently suspicious. And he is, as a class, continually and systematically deprived of his little accumulations. One great financial operation after another in the modern world, as any well-informed person can witness, eats up the small investor. Some huge, vastly respectable-looking enterprise is floated with a capital of so many scores or hundreds of thousands, divided into so many thousands of ordinary shares, so many 5 or 6% preference, so much debentures. It begins its career with a flourish of prosperity. The ordinary shares for a few years pay 7, 8, 10%. The virtuous small man provides for his widow and his old age by buying this estimable security. Its price clambers to a premium, and so it passes slowly and steadily from its first speculative holder into the hands of the investing public. Then comes a slow, quiet downward movement, a check at the interim dividend, a rapid contraction. Consider such a case as that of the Great British Electric Traction Company, which began with ordinary shares at 10, which clambered above 21 shillings 7 and 8, which is now October 1907, fluctuating about 2. Its 6% preference shares have moved between 14 and 5.5. Its ordinary shares represent a total capital of £1,333,010. and its preference £1,614,370. So that here, in this one concern, we have a phantom appearance and disappearance of over £2 million worth of value and real disappearance of perhaps half that amount. It requires only a very slight knowledge of the world to convince one that the bulk of that sum was contributed by the modest investments of mediocre and small people out of touch with the real conditions of the world of finance. These little investors, it is said, are the bitter champions of private finance against the municipalities and socialists. One wonders why. One could find a score of parallels and worse instances representing in the end many scores of millions of pounds taken from the investing public in the last few years. I will, however, content myself with one sober quotation from the New York Journal of Commerce, which, the reader will admit, is not likely to be a willing witness for socialism. Commenting on the testimony of the principal witness, Mr. Harriman of the Illinois Central Railroad, before the Interstate Commerce Commission, March 1907, it says, "On his own admission, he was one of a combine of 4 who got possession of the Chicago and Alton Railroad and immediately issued bonds for $40 million out of the proceeds of which they paid themselves a dividend of 30% on the stock they held, besides taking the bonds at 65 and subsequently selling them at 90 or more. Some of them to life insurance companies with which Mr. Harriman had some kind of relation. There were no earnings or surplus out of which the dividend could be paid, but the books of the company were juggled by transferring some $12 million expended for betterments to capital account as a sort of bookkeeping basis for the performance. Besides this, the Chicago and Alton Railroad was transformed into a railway, and a capitalization of a little under $40 million was swollen to nearly $123 million to cover an actual expenditure in improvements of $22,500,000. In the process, there was an injection of about $60,600,000 of water into the stock held by the 4. Some of which was sold to the Union Pacific, of which Mr. Harriman was president, and more was uploaded upon the Rock Island. Mr. Harriman refused to tell how much he made out of that operation. It shows how some of our enormous fortunes are made, as well as what motives and purposes sometimes prevail in the use of the power entrusted to the directors and officers of corporations. It is a simple and elementary principle that all values are created by the productive activity of capital, labor, and ability in industrial operations of one kind and another. No wealth comes out of nothing, but all must be produced and distributed, and what one gets by indirection another loses or fails to get. The personal profit of these speculative operations, in which the capital, credit, and power of corporations are used by those entrusted with their direction, come out of the general body of stockholders whose interests are sacrificed, or out of the public investors who are lured and deceived, or out of shippers who are overtaxed for the service for which railroads are chartered, or out of all these in varying proportions. In other words, they are the fruits of robbery. So that you see it is not only untrue that socialism would rob a poor man of his virtuously acquired bit of property, but the direct contrary is the truth, that the present system, non-socialism, is now constantly butchering thrift. Simple people believe the great financiers win and lose money to each other. They are not, to put it plainly, such fools. They use the public, and the public goes on being used, as a perpetual source of freshly accumulated wealth. I know one case of a man of 50 who serves in a shop, a most industrious, competent man who has been saving and investing money all his life in what he had every reason to believe were safe and sober businesses. He has been denying himself pleasures, cramping his life to put by about a third of his wages every year since he was 22, And today he has not got his keep for a couple of years, and his only security against disablement and old age is his subscription to a friendly society. A society which I have a very strong suspicion is no better off than most other friendly societies, and that is by no means well off, and by no means confident of the future. It is possible to argue that the small man ought to take more pains about his investments, but, as a matter of fact, investing money securely and profitably is a special occupation of extraordinary complexity, and the common man with a few £100 has no more chance in that market than he would have under water in Sydney Harbour amidst a shoal of sharks. It may be said that he is greedy, wants too much interest, but that is nonsense. One of the crudest gulfs into which small savings have gone in the case of the British public has been the trap of consols, which pay at the present price less than 3%. Servants and working men with post office savings bank accounts were urged, tempted, and assisted to invest in this solemn security, even when it stood at 114. Those who did so have now, November 1907, lost almost a third of their money. It is scarcely too much to say that a very large proportion of our modern great properties, tramway systems, railways, gasworks, bread companies, have been created for their present owners, the debenture holders and mortgagers, the great capitalists, by the unintentional altruism of that voluntary martyr, the saving small man. Of course, the habitual saver can insure with an insurance company for his old age and against all sorts of misadventures, and because of the government interference with private enterprise in that sort of business, be reasonably secure. But under socialism he would be able to do that with absolute security in the state insurance office, if the universal old age pension did not satisfy him. That, however, is beside our present discussion. I am writing now only of the sort of property that socialism would destroy, and to show how little benefit or safety it brings to the small owner now. The unthinking rich prate thrift to the poor, and grow richer by a half-judicious, half-unconscious absorption of the resultant savings. That, in brief, is the grim humour of our present financial method. It is not only in relation to investments that this absorption of small parcels of savings goes on. In every town, the intelligent and sympathetic observer may see, vivid before the eyes of all who are not blind by use and want, the slow subsidence of petty accumulations. The lodging-house and the small retail shop are, as it were, social destructors. All over the country they are converting hopeful, ill-enterprising, ill-advised people with a few score or hundreds of pounds, slowly, inevitably, into broken-hearted failures. It is, to my mind, the crudest aspect of our economic struggle. In the little high street of Sandgate, over which my house looks, I should say between a quarter and a third of the shops are such downward channels from decency to despair. They are sanctioned, inevitable citizen breakers. Now it is a couple of old servants opening a fancy shop or a tobacco shop. Now it is a young couple ploughing into haberdashery. Now it is a new butcher, or a new fishmonger or grocer. This perpetual procession of bankruptcies has made me lately shun that pleasant-looking street that in my unthinking days I walked through cheerfully enough. The doomed victims have a way of coming to the doors at first and looking out politely and hopefully. There is a rich and lucrative business done by certain wholesale firms in starting the small dealer in almost every branch of retail trade. They fit up his shop, stock him, take his £100 or £200 and give him credit for 40 or 50. The rest of his story is an impossible struggle to pay rent and get that debt down. Things go on for a time quite bravely. I go furtively and examine the goods in the window, with a dim hope that this time something really will come off. I learn reluctantly from my wife that they are no better than anyone else's, and rather dearer than those of the one or two solid and persistent shops that do the steady business of the place. Perhaps I see the new people going to church once or twice very respectably, as I set out for a Sunday walk, and if they are a young couple, the husband usually wears a silk hat. Presently, the stock in the window begins to deteriorate in quantity and quality, and then I know that credit is tightening. The proprietor no longer comes to the door, and his first bright confidence is gone. He suspects, one all too truly, of dealing with the stores. Then suddenly he has gone. The savings are gone, and the shop, like a hungry maw, waits for a new victim. There is the simple common tragedy of the little shop. The landlord of the house has his money all right. The ground landlord has, of course, every penny of his money. The kindly wholesalers are well out of it, and the young couple or the old people, as the case may be, are looking for work or the nearest casual ward, just as though there was no such virtue as thrift in the world. The particular function of the British lodging-house, though the science of economics is silent on this point, is to use up the last strength of the trusty old servant and the plucky widow. These people will invest from 200 or 300 to £1,000 in order to gain a bare subsistence by toiling for boarders and lodgers. It is their idea of a safe investment. They can see it all the time. All over England this process goes on. The curious inquirer may see every face for himself by simply looking for rooms among the apartment houses of such a region as Camden Town, London. He will realize more and more surely as he goes about that none of these people gain money. None of them ever recover the capital they sink. They are happy if they die before their inevitable financial extinction. It is so habitual with people to think of classes as stable, of a butcher or a baker as a man who keeps a shop of a certain sort at a certain level throughout a long and indeterminate life, that it may seem incredible to many readers that those two typically thrifty classes, the lodging-letter household and the small retailer, are maintained by a steady supply of failing individuals. The fact remains that it is so. Their little savings are no good to them. Investments and business beginnings mock them alike. Steadily, relentlessly, our competitive system eats them up. It is said that no class of people in the community is more hostile to socialism and socialistic legislation than these small owners and petty investors, these small ratepayers. They do not understand. Rent they consider in the nature of things like hunger and thirst. The economic process that dooms the weak enterprise to ruin is beyond the scope of their intelligence. But the rate collector who calls and calls again for money, for more money, to educate other people's children, to keep paupers in luxury, to waste upon roads and light and trams, seems the agent of an unendurable wrong. So the poor creatures go out pallidly angry to vote down that hated thing, municipal enterprise, and to make still more scope for that big finance that crushes them in the winepress of its exploitation. It is a wretched and tragic antagonism for which every intelligent socialist must needs have sympathy, which he must meet with patience and lucid explanations. If the public authority took rent, there would be no need of rates. That is the more obvious proposition. But the ampler one is the cruelty, the absurdity, and the social injury of the constant consumption of unprotected savings, which is an essential part of our present system. It is a doctrinaire and old-fashioned socialism that quarrels with the little horde. The quarrel of modern socialism is with the landowner and the great capitalist who devour it. Part 4. While we are discussing the true attitude of modern socialism to property, it will be well to explain quite clearly the secular change of opinion that is going on in the socialist ranks in regard to the process of expropriation. Even in the case of those sorts of property that socialism repudiates, property in land, natural productions, inherited business capital, and the like, socialism has become humanized and rational from its first extreme and harsh positions. The earlier socialism was fierce and unjust to owners. Property is robbery, said Proudhon, and right down to the 90s, socialism kept too much of the spirit of that proposition. The property owner was to be promptly and entirely deprived of his goods, and to think himself lucky he was not lynched forthwith as an abominable rascal. The first basis of the Fabian Society, framed so lately as 1884, seems to repudiate compensation, even a partial compensation of property owners, though in its practical proposals the Fabian Society has always admitted compensatory arrangements. The exact words of the basis are, without compensation, though not without such relief to expropriate individuals as may seem fit to the community. The wording is pretty evidently the result of a compromise between modern views and older teachings. If the Fabian Society were rewriting its basis now, I doubt if any section would insist even upon that eviscerated without compensation. Now, property is not robbery. It may be a mistake. It may be unjust and socially disadvantageous to recognize private property in these great common interests. But everyone concerned, and the majority of the property owners certainly, held and hold in good faith and do their best by the light they have. We live today in a vast tradition of relationships in which the rightfulness of that kind of private property is assumed, and suddenly, instantly, to deny and abolish it would be, I write this as a convinced and thorough socialist, quite the most dreadful catastrophe human society could experience. For what sort of provisional government should we have in that confusion? Expropriation must be a gradual process, a process of economic and political readjustment, accompanied at every step by an explanatory educational advance. There is no reason why a cultivated property owner should not welcome and hasten its coming. Modern socialism is prepared to compensate him, perhaps not fully, but reasonably, for his renunciations, and to avail itself of his help, to relieve him of his administrative duties, his excess of responsibility for estate and business. It does not grudge him a compensating annuity, nor terminating rights of user. It has no intention of obliterating him, nor the things he cares for. It wants not only to socialize his possessions, but to socialize his achievement in culture and all that leisure has taught him of the possibilities of life. Its enemy is not the rich man, but the aggressive rich man, the usurer, the sweater, the giant plunderer, who are developing the latent evil of riches. It repudiates altogether the conception of a bitter class war between those who have and those who have not. But this new tolerant spirit in method involves no weakening of the ultimate conception. Modern socialism sets itself absolutely against the creation of new private property out of land, or rights, or concessions not yet assigned. All new great monopolistic enterprises in transit, building and cultivation for example, must from the first be under public ownership. and the chief work of social statesmanship, the secular process of government, must be the steady, orderly resumption by the community, without violence and without delay, of the land, of the apparatus of transit, of communication, of food distribution, and of all the great common services of mankind, and the care and training of a new generation in their collective use and in more civilized conceptions of living. Chapter 8. The Middle-Class Man, the Businessman, and Socialism. Part 1. Let me insert here a few remarks upon a question that arises naturally out of the preceding discussion, and that is the future of that miscellaneous section of the community known as the middle class. It is one that I happen to know with a peculiar intimacy. For a century or more, the grinding out of the middle class has been going on. I began to find it interesting, altogether too interesting indeed, when I was still only a little boy. My father was one of that multitude of small shopkeepers which has been caught between the stores and such like big distributors above and the rising rates below, and from the Knickerbocker stage onward I was acutely aware of the question hanging over us. This isn't going on, was the proposition. This shop in which our capital is invested will never return it. Nobody seems to understand what is happening, and there is nobody to advise or help us. What are we going to do? Except that people are beginning to understand a little now what it all means. Exactly the same question hangs over many hundreds of thousands of households today, not only over the hundreds of small shopkeepers, but of small professional men, of people living upon small parcels of investments, of clerks who find themselves growing old and their value depreciated by the competition of a new, better educated generation, of private schoolmasters, of boarding and lodging house keepers, and the like. They are all vaguely aware of something more than personal failure, of a drift and process which is against all their kind, of the need of doing something for themselves and their children, something different from just sticking to the shop or the situation, and they don't know what to do. What ought they to do? Well, first, before one answers that, let us ask what it is exactly that is grinding the middle class in this way. Is it a process we can stop? Can we direct the millstones? If we can, ought we to do so? And if we cannot, or decide that it isn't worthwhile, then what can we do to mitigate this cruelty of slowly impoverishing and taxing out of existence a class that was once the backbone of the community? It is not mere humanity dictates this much. It is a question that affects the state as a whole. It must be extremely bad for the spirit of the nation and for our national future that its middle class should be in a state of increasing financial worry and stress, irritated, depressed, and broken in courage. One effect is manifest in our British politics now. Each fresh election turns upon expenditure more evidently than the last, and the promise to reduce taxation or lower the rates overrides more and more certainly any other consideration. What are empire or education to men who feel themselves drifting helplessly into debt? What chance has any constructive scheme with an electorate of men who are being slowly submerged in an economic bog? The process that has brought the middle class into these troubles is a complex one. But the essential thing about it seems to be this, that there is a change of scale going on in most human affairs, a substitution of big organizations for detached individual effort almost everywhere. 150 years ago or so, the only very rich people in the community were a handful of great landowners and a few bankers. The rest of the world's business was being done by small, prosperous, independent men. The labourers were often very poor and wretched, ill-clad, bootless, badly housed, and short of food, but there was nevertheless a great deal of middle-class comfort and prosperity. The country was covered with flourishing farmers, every country town was a little world in itself, with busy tradespeople and professional men. Manufacturing was still done mainly by small people employing a few hands, master and apprentice working together. In every town you found a private school or so, an independent doctor, and the like, doing well in a mediocre, comfortable fashion. All the carrying trade was in the hands of small independent carriers. The shipping was held by hundreds of small shipowners, and London itself was only a larger country town. It was, in effect, a middle-class world ruled over by aristocrats. The millstones had as yet scarcely stirred. Then machinery came into the lives of men, and steam power, and there began that change of scale which is going on still today, making an ever-widening separation of master and man, and an ever-enlarging organization of industry and social method. Its most striking manifestation was at first the substitution of organized manufacture in factories for the half-domestic hand-industrialism of the earlier period. The growth of the fortunes of some of the merchants and manufacturers to dimensions comparable with the wealth of the great landowners, and the sinking of the rest of their class towards the status of wage earners. The development of joint stock enterprise arose concurrently with this to create a new sort of partnership capable of handling far greater concerns than any single wealthy person, as wealth was measured by the old scale could do. There followed a great development of transit, culminating for a time in the coming of the railways and steamships, which abolished the isolation of the old towns and brought men at the remotest quarters of the earth into business competition. Big towns of the modern type, with 500,000 inhabitants or more, grew up rapidly all over Europe and America. For the European big towns are as modern as New York, and the East End and South Side of London scarcely older than Chicago. Shopkeeping, like manufactures, began to concentrate in large establishments and big wholesale distribution to replace individual buying and selling. As the need for public education under the changing conditions of life grew more and more urgent, the individual enterprise of this schoolmaster and that gave place to the organized effort of such giant societies as, in Britain, the old National School Society and the British School Society, and at last to state education. And one after another, the old prosperous middle-class callings fell under the stress of the new development. This process still goes on, and there can be little doubt of the ultimate issue. The old small manufacturers are either ruined or driven into sweating and the slums. The old coaching innkeeper and common carrier have been impoverished or altogether superseded by the railways and big carrier companies. The once flourishing shopkeeper lives today on the mere remnants of the trade that great distributing stores or the branches of great companies have left him. Tea companies, provision dealing companies, tobacconist companies make the position of the old established private shop unstable and the chances of the new beginner hopeless. Railways and tramways take the custom more and more effectually past the door of the small draper and outfitter to the well-stocked establishments at the centre of things. Telephone and telegraph assist that shopping at the centre more and more. The small middle-class schoolmaster finds himself beaten by revived, endowed schools and by new public endowments. The small doctor, the local dentist, find Harley Street always nearer to them and practitioners in motor cars from the great centres playing havoc with their practices. And while the small men are more and more distressed, the great organizations of trade, of production, of public science continue to grow and coalesce, until at last they grow into national or even world trusts, or into publicly owned monopolies. In America, slaughtering and selling meat has grown into a trust. Steel and iron are trustified. Mineral oil is all gathered into a few hands. All through the trades and professions and sciences and all over the world, the big eats up the small. The new enlarged scale replaces the old. And this is equally true, though it is only now beginning to be recognized, of the securities of that other section of the middle class, the section which lives upon invested money. There too, big eats little. There too, the small man is more and more manifestly at the mercy of the large organizations. It was a pleasant illusion of the Victorian time that one put one's £100 or £1,000 into something, beside the rich man's tens of thousands, and drew one's secure and satisfying dividends. The intelligent reader of Mr. Lawson's Frenzied Finance, or of the bankruptcy proceedings of Mr. Hooley, realizes this idyll is scarcely true to nature. Through the seas and shallows of investment flow great tides and depressions, on which the big fortunes ride to harbour while the little accumulations, capsized and swamped, quiver down to the bottom. It becomes more and more true that the small man saves his money for the rich man's pocket. Only by drastic state intervention is a certain measure of safety secured for insurance, and in America recently we have had the spectacle of the people's insurance money used as a till by the rich financiers. And when the middle-class man turns in his desperation from the advance of the big competitor, who is consuming him, as a big codfish eats its little brother, to the state, he meets a tax paper. He sees as the state's most immediate aspect the rate collector and inexorable demands. The burthen of taxation certainly falls upon him, and it falls upon him because he is collectively the weakest class that possesses any property to be taxed. Below him are classes either too poor to tax or too politically effective to stand taxation. Above him is the class which owns a large part of the property in the world, but it also owns the newspapers and periodicals that are necessary for an adequate discussion of social justice, and it finds it cheaper to pay a voluntary tax to the hoardings at election time than to take over the small man's burdens. He rolls about between these two parties, antagonized first to one and then the other, and altogether helpless and ineffectual. So the millstones grind, and so it would seem they will continue to grind until there is nothing between them, until organized property in the hands of the few on the one hand, and the proletariat on the other, grind face to face. So at least Karl Marx taught in Das Kapital. But when one says the middle class will disappear, one means that it will disappear as a class. Its individuals and its children will survive, and the whole process is not nearly so fatalistic as the Marxists would have us believe. The new great organizations that are replacing the little private enterprises of the world before machinery are not all private property. There are alternatives in the matter of handling a great business. To the exact nature of these alternatives, the middle-class mind needs to direct itself if it is to exert any control whatever over its future. Take the case of the butcher. It is manifestly written on the scroll of destiny that the little private slaughterhouse, the little independent butcher's shop, buying and selling locally must disappear. The meat will all be slaughtered at some great conveniently organized centre and distributed thence to shops that will necessarily be mere agencies for distributing meat. Now, this great slaughtering and distributing business may either be owned by one or a group of owners working it for profit, in which case it will be necessary for the state to employ an unremunerative army of inspectors to see that the business is kept decently clean and honest, or it may be run by the public authority. In the former case, the present-day butcher or his son will be a slaughterman or shopkeeper employed by the private owners, in the latter case by the public authority. This is equally true of a milk seller, of a small manufacturer, of a builder, of 101 other trades. They are bound to be incorporated in a larger organization. They are bound to become salaried men, where formerly they were independent men, and it is no good struggling against that. It is doubtful indeed whether from the standpoint of welfare it would be worth the middle-class man's while to struggle against that. But in the case of very many great public services, meat, milk, bread, transit, housing and land administration, education and research, and the public health, it is still an open question whether the big organization is to be publicly owned, publicly controlled, and constantly refreshed by public scrutiny and comment, or whether it is to be privately owned and conducted solely for the profit of a small group of very rich owners. The alternatives are plutocracy or socialism, and between these the middle-class man remains weakly undecided and ineffectual, lending no weight to and getting small consideration therefore from either side. He remains so because he has not grasped the real nature of his problem, because he clings in the face of overwhelming fate to the belief that in some way the wheels of change may be arrested and his present method of living preserved. I think if he could shake himself free from that impossible conservatism, he would realize that his interests lie with the interests of the intelligent working-class man, that is to say, in the direction of socialism, rather than in the direction of capitalistic competition, that the best use he can make of such educational and social advantages as still remain for him is to become the willing leader instead of the panic-fierce antagonist of the socialist movement. His place, I hold, is to forward the development of that state and municipal machinery the socialist foreshadows, and to secure for himself and his sons and daughters an adequate position and voice in the administration. Instead of struggling to diminish that burthen of public expenditure which educates and houses, conveys and protects him and his children, he ought rather to increase it joyfully, while at the same time working manfully to transfer its pressure to the broad shoulders of those very rich people who have hitherto evaded their legitimate share of it. The other course is to continue his present policy of obstinate resistance to the extension of public property and public services, in which case these things will necessarily become that basis of monopolistic property on which the coming plutocracy will establish itself. The middle-class man will be taxed and competed out of independence just the same, and he will become a salaried officer just the same, but with a different sort of master and under different social conditions, according as one or the other of these alternatives prevails. Which is the better master, the democratic state or a combine of millionaires? Which will give the best social atmosphere for one's children to breathe, a plutocracy or a socialism? That is the real question to which the middle-class man should address himself. No doubt to many minds a plutocracy presents many attractions. In the works of Thomas Love Peacock, and still more clearly in the works of Mr. W. H. Mallock, you will find an agreeable rendering of that conception. The bulk of the people will be organized out of sight in a state of industrious and productive congestion, and a wealthy, leisurely, and refined minority will live in spacious houses with excellent museums, libraries, and all the equipments of culture. Will go to town, concentrate in Paris, London, and Rome, and travel about the world. It is to these large, luxurious, powerful lives that the idealist naturally turns. Their motor cars, their aeroplanes, their steam yachts will awaken terror and respect in every corner of the globe. Their handsome doings will fill the papers. They will patronize the arts and literature, while at the same time mellowing them by eliminating that too urgent insistence upon contemporary fact which makes so much of what is done today harsh and displeasing. The middle-class tradition will be continued by a class of stewards, tenants, managers and foremen, secretaries and the like, respected and respectful. The writer, the artist, will lead lives of comfortable dependence, a link between class and class, the lowest of the rich man's guests, the highest of his servants. As for the masses, they will be fed with a sort of careless vigour and considerable economy from the Chicago stockyards, and by agricultural produce trusts, big breweries, fresh water companies, and the like. They will be organized industrially and carefully controlled. Their spiritual needs will be provided for by churches endowed by the wealthy, their physical distresses alleviated by the hope of getting charitable aid, their lives made bright and adventurous by the crumbs of sport that fall from the rich man's table. They will crowd to see the motor car races, the aeroplane competitions. It will be a world rich in contrasts, and not without its gleam of pure adventure. Every bright young fellow of capacity will have the hope of catching the eye of some powerful personage, of being advanced to some high position of trust, of even ending his days as a partner, a subordinate assistant plutocrat. Or he may win a quite agreeable position by literary or artistic merit. A pretty girl, a clever woman of the middle class, would have before her even more brilliant and romantic possibilities. There can be no denying the promises of colour and eventfulness a plutocracy holds out, and though they do not attract me, I can quite understand their appeal to the more ductile and appreciative mind of Mr. Mallock. But there are countervailing considerations. There is, it is said, a tendency in plutocracies either to become unprogressive, unenterprising, and stagnantly autocratic, or to develop states of stress and discontent, and so drift towards Caesarism. The latter was the fate of the Roman Republic, and may perhaps be the destiny of the budding young plutocracy of America. But the developing British plutocracy, like the Carthaginian, will be largely Semitic in blood, and like the Carthaginian may resist these insurgent tendencies. So much for the plutocratic possibility. If the middle-class man on any account does not like that outlook, he can turn in the other direction, and then he will find fine promises indeed, but much more uncertainty than towards plutocracy. Plutocracies the world has seen before, but a democratic civilization organized upon the lines laid down by modern socialists would be a new beginning in the world's history. It is not a thing that will come about by itself. It will have to be the outcome of a sustained moral and intellectual effort in the community. If there is not that effort, if things go on as they are going now, the coming of a plutocracy is inevitable. That effort, I am convinced, cannot be successfully made by the lower-class man alone. From him, unaided and unguided, there is nothing to be expected but wild convulsive attempts at social upheaval, which, whether they succeed, as the French Revolution did, or fail, as did the insurrectionary outbreaks of the Republic in Rome, lead ultimately to a Napoleon or a Caesar. But our contemporary civilization is unprecedented in the fact that the whole population now reads, and that intelligence and free discussion saturate the whole mass. Only time can show what possibilities of understanding, leadership, and political action lie in our new generation of the better educated middle class. Will it presently begin to define a line for itself? Will it remain disorganized and passive, or will it become intelligent and decisive between these millstones of the organized property and the organizing state, between plutocracy and socialism, whose opposition is the supreme social and political fact in the world at the present time? Part 2. Perhaps also it may be helpful here to insert a view of the contemporary possibilities of socialism from a rather different angle, a view that follows on to the matter of the previous section, but appeals to a different section of the middle class. It is a quotation from the Magazine of Commerce for September 1907, and leads to an explanation by the present writer. The recent return of Mr. Grayson, a socialist, as a Member of Parliament for the Colne Valley, has brought prominently before the public mind the question of socialism. Mr. Pete Curran's success at Jarrow a month or so ago, and the large number of Labour members returned at the last general election, caused more or less desultory comment on socialism as a possible feature of practical politics in the remote future. But Mr. Grayson can certainly claim that his achievement at Colne Valley brought the question of socialism into the very forefront at one bound. It is difficult to ignore socialism, to dismiss it as a mere fad and fancy of a few harebrained enthusiasts after Mr. Grayson's success. The verdict of Colne Valley may be the verdict of many another constituency where the so-called working-class electors are numerically predominant. When we consider that the manual worker represents the majority of the electorate of the country, this contingency does not appear to be so very remote, provided that the leaders of socialism can organize their resources and canvass the working men on a wide and carefully planned scale. In this respect, the Colne Valley result may very well give them the lead and stimulus they have been waiting for. It must be borne in mind, too, that the forward section of the Labour Party is avowedly socialist in its sympathies, and a definite start may therefore be said to have been made towards capturing the machinery of government in the cause of socialism. How will socialism affect the business world? This is a question which many thoughtful businessmen must have already put to themselves. For reply, we must go to the leaders of socialism and discover what their policy actually is. The common impression that socialism spells barefaced confiscation is too superficial to be seriously adduced as an argument against socialism. The leaders of the cause include some of the cleverest men of the day, men who have a more rational basis for their policy than that of simply robbing Peter to pay Paul. The suggestion that socialism means a compulsory share-out may be rightly dismissed as an idle scare. The most bitter opponent of socialism must at least admit that there is a stronger argument to be met than that implied by the parrot cry of spoliation. Socialism has, at any rate, so far advanced as to be allowed the ordinary courtesies of debate. We may oppose it tooth and nail, but we must confront argument with argument and not with abuse. Despite much excellent literature which is read widely by cultured people, very little is known by the general public of the principles which modern British socialists have adopted as their guiding rules. Few businessmen care to study the subject. We have therefore addressed a letter to the chief leaders of the cause with the purpose of ascertaining the effect which socialism would have on our business habits. Our object was to discover how far socialism might disturb or improve business, whether it would altogether subvert present methods, or whether it could be applied without injury to these methods. To put the matter very plainly, we wished to learn whether we should carry on our business much as we do now, giving free play to individual effort and individual fortune building. The reply of Mr. Wells is as follows. My dear Sir, I wish very much I could reply at adequate length to your very admirably framed question. The constant stream of abuse and of almost imbecile misrepresentations of socialism in the press has no doubt served to distort the idea of our movement in the minds of a large proportion of busy men, and filled them with an unfounded dread of social insecurity. If it were possible to allay that by an epigrammatic program, socialism in a nutshell, so to speak, I would do my best. But the economic and trading system of a modern state is not only a vast and complex tangle of organizations, but at present an uncharted tangle, and necessarily the methods of transition from the limited individualism of our present condition to the scientifically organized state, which is the socialist ideal, must be gradual, tentative, and various. To build up a body of social and economic science, to develop a class of trained administrators, to rearrange local government areas, to educate the whole community in the sense of the state, are necessary parts of the socialist scheme. You must try and induce your readers to recognize that when socialism finds such supporters as Sir Oliver Lodge and Professor Karl Pearson, as William Morris, who revolutionized the furniture trade, as Granville Barker, who is revolutionizing the London stage, as Mr. George Cadbury and Mr. Fells, whose names are not unknown in the world of advertisement, as Mr. Allen of the Allen line, as Mr. George Bernard Shaw and Mrs. Shaw, Mr. and Mrs. Sidney Webb and Sir Sidney Oliver, the present Governor of Jamaica. All of them fairly comfortable and independent people, practically acquainted with the business of investment and affairs, generally and quite alive to the present relations of property to the civilized life. The suggestion that it is a raid of the ignorant have-nots on the possessions of the wise and good haves cannot be a very intelligent one, nor addressed to very intelligent people. Essentially, socialism is the scientifically organized state as distinguished from the haphazard, wasteful, blundering, child-sweating state of the 18th century. It is the systemization of present tendency. Necessarily, its methods of transition will be progressively scientific and humane. So far as your specific questions go, I do not think there could possibly be anything in the nature of compulsory profit-sharing if a socialist government came into office. There is at present a compulsory profit-sharing in the form of an income tax, but that tax does not appeal to the socialist as a particularly scientific one. The advent of a strongly socialist government would mean no immediate revolutionary changes at all. There would be, no doubt, a vigorous acceleration of the educational movement to increase the economic value and productivity of the average citizen of the next generation, and legislation upon the lines laid down by the principle of the minimum wage to check the waste of our national resources by destructive employment. Also, a systematic shifting of the burthen of taxation from enterprise to rent would begin, but nothing convulsive would occur. The means of transit and communication of the country, both internal and external, and especially the railways and canals, which are now rapidly falling into inefficiency through the exhaustion of their capital upon excessive dividends in the past, would probably be transferred from competitive private to organized public control, a transfer that would certainly be enormously stimulating to business generally. There would be no robbery. The former shareholders would become stock or annuity holders. Nor would there be any financial convulsion due to the raising of the enormous sum necessary to effect this purchase. The country would simply create stock, while at the same time taking over assets to balance the new liability. A socialist government would certainly also acquire the coal mines and the coal trade, and relieve industry from the inconveniences due to the manipulation of the supply of this vitally important factor, and it would accelerate the obvious tendency of the present time to bring the milk trade, the drink trade, slaughtering, local traffic, lighting and power supply into public hands. But none of this is the destruction of property, but only its organization and standardization. Such a state organization of public services is, I submit, enough to keep a socialist government busy for some few years, and makes not only for social progress, but social stability. And does an honest and capable businessman stand to lose or gain by the coming of such a socialist government? I submit that, on the whole, he stands to gain. Let me put down the essential points in this outlook as I conceive them. Under a socialist government, such as is quite possible in England at the present time, he will be restricted from methods of production and sale that are socially mischievous. He will pay higher wages. He will pay a larger proportion of his rate rent outgoings to the state and municipality, and less to the landlord. Ultimately, he will pay it all to the state or municipality, and as a voter help to determine how it shall be spent, and the landlord will become a government stockholder. Practically, he will get his rent returned to him in public services. He will speedily begin to get better educated, better fed, and better trained workers, so that he will get money value for the higher wages he pays. He will get a regular, safe, cheap supply of power and material. He will get cheaper and more efficient internal and external transit. He will be under an organized scientific state, which will naturally pursue a vigorous scientific collective policy in support of the national trade. He will be less of an adventurer and more of a citizen. So I wrote to the Magazine of Commerce, and that for the energetic man who is conducting a real and socially useful business is the outlook. Socialism is not the coming of chaos and repudiation, it is the coming of order and justice. For confusion and accident and waste, the socialist seeks to substitute design and collective economy. That, too, is the individual aim of every good businessman who is not a mere advertising cheat or financial adventurer. To the sound-minded, clear-headed man of affairs, socialism appeals just as it appeals to the scientific man, to the engineer, to the artist, because it is the same reality, the large-scale aspect of the same constructive motive that stirs in himself. Part 3. Let me finally quote the chairman of one of the most enterprising and enlightened business organizations of our time to show that in claiming the better type of businessman for modern socialism, I am making no vain boast. Sir John Brunner may not call himself a socialist, but this is very probably due to the fact that he gets his ideas of socialism from the misquotations of its interested adversaries. This that follows from the Manchester Guardian is pure socialism. Speaking at the annual meeting of Brunner, Mond & Co. Limited in Liverpool 1907, the chairman, Sir John Brunner MP, made a remarkable pronouncement on the subject of the collective ownership of canals. He said, "I have been one of the Royal Commission visiting the north of France, Belgium, and northern Germany, and our duty has been to examine what those three countries have done in the improvement of their canals and their waterways. We have been very deeply impressed by what we have seen, and I can tell you today, speaking as a man of business to men of business, that the fact that in these 3 countries there is a communal effort, that is to say, that the state, in money and in credit for the benefit of the national trade, has brought to those 3 countries enormous, almost incalculable benefits. And I think that any man, any intelligent man, who studies this matter as I have studied it for a great many years, will come the conclusion, as I have come very clearly and decidedly, that the old policy, which we have adopted for generations, of leaving all public works to private enterprise, the old policy, so-called of laissez-faire, is played out completely, and I am of opinion, very firmly, that, if we mean to hold our own in matters of trade, we must learn to follow the example that has been set us not only by France, Belgium, and Germany, but by the United States, and by every one of the colonies of our empire. Everywhere do you find that trade is helped by the effort of the community, by the force of the state, and I shall be very heartily pleased if those who hear me will think the matter over and decide for themselves whether or not we as business people, preeminently the business people of the world, are to maintain the old policy of leaving everything to private enterprise, or whether we are to act together for the good of all in this important matter of the national trade. Chapter 9. Some Common Objections to Socialism. Part 1. In the preceding 8 chapters, I have sought to give as plain and a full an account of the great generalizations of socialism as I can, and to make it clear exactly what these generalizations convey and how far they go in this direction and that. Before we go on to a brief historical and anticipatory account of the actual socialist movement, it may be worthwhile to take up and consider compactly the chief objections that are urged against the general propositions of socialism in popular discussion. Now, a very large proportion of these arise out of the commonest vice of the human mind, its disposition to see everything as yes or no, as black or white, its impatience, its incapacity for a fine discrimination of intermediate shades. See Note 14. The queer old scholastic logic still prevails remarkably in our modern world. You find Mr. Mallock, for example, going about arranging his syllogisms, extracting his opponent's self-contradictions, and disposing of socialism with stupendous self-satisfaction in all the magazines. He disposes of socialism quite in the spirit of the young medieval scholar returning home to prove beyond dispute that my cat has 10 tails, and, given a yard's start, that a tortoise can always keep ahead of a running man. The essential fallacy is always to declare that either a thing is A or is not A. Either a thing is green or it is not green. Either a thing is heavy or it is not heavy. Unthinking people, and some who ought to know better, fall into that trap. They dismiss from their minds the fact that there is a tinge of green in nearly every object in the world, and that there is no such thing as pure green, unless it be just one line or so in the long series of the spectrum. They forget that the lightest thing has weight, and that the heaviest thing can be lifted. The rest of the process is simple, and has no relation whatever to the realities of life. They agree to some hard and fast impossible definition of socialism, permit the exponent to extract absurdities therefrom as a conjurer gets rabbits from a hat, and retire with a conviction that on the whole it is well to have had this disturbing matter settled once for all. Note 14. See Scepticism of the Instrument, the appendix to A Modern Utopia, Chapman and Hall. For example, the anti-socialist declares that socialism abolishes property. He makes believe there is a hard absolute thing called property, which must either be or not be, which is now and which will not be under socialism. To any person with a philosophical education, this is a ridiculous mental process, but it seems perfectly rational to an untrained mind, and that is the usual case with the anti-socialist. Having achieved this initial absurdity, he then asks, in a tone of bitter protest, whether a man may not sleep in his own bed. And is he to do nothing if he finds a coal heaver already in possession when he retires? This is the method of Mr. G.R. Sims, that delightful writer, who, from altitudes of exhaustive misunderstanding, tells the working man that under socialism he will have, I forget his exact formula, but it is a sort of refrain. No money of his own, no home of his own, no wife of his own, no hair of his own. It is effective nonsense in its way, but nonsense nevertheless. In my preceding chapters, I hope I have made it clear that property, even today, is a very qualified and uncertain thing, a natural vague instinct capable of perversion and morbid exaggeration, and needing control, and that socialism seeks simply to give it a sharper, juster, and rationally limited form in relation to the common weal. Or again, the opponent has it that socialism abolishes the family, and with it, of course, every sacred and tender association, etc., etc. To that also I have given a chapter. I do not think much anti-socialism is dishonest in these matters. The tricks of deliberate falsification, forgery and falsehood that discredit a few Conservative candidates and speakers in the north of England and smirch the reputations of one or two London papers are due to a quite exceptional streak of baseness in what is on the whole a straightforward opposition to socialism. Anti-socialism, as its name implies, is no alternative doctrine. It is a mental resistance, not a mental force. For the most part, one is dealing with sheer intellectual incapacity, with people, muddle-headed perhaps, but quite well-meaning, who are really unable to grasp the quantitative element in things. They think with a simple flat certitude that if, for example, a doctor says quinine is good for a case, it means that he wishes to put every ounce of quinine that can be procured into his patient, to focus all the quinine in the world upon him, or that if a woman says she likes dancing, that thereby she declares her intention to dance until she drops. They are dear, lumpish souls who like things straightforward, as they say, all or nothing. They think qualifications or any quantitative treatment quibbling, to be loudly scorned, bawled down, and set aside. In controversy, the temptations for a hot and generous temperament, eager for victory, to misstate and overstate the antagonist's position are enormous, and the sensible socialist must allow for them unless he is to find discussion intolerable. The reader of the preceding chapters should know exactly how socialism stands to the family relations, the things it urges, the things it regards with impartiality or patient toleration, the things it leaves alone. The preceding chapters merely summarize a literature that has been accessible for years. Yet it is extraordinary how few antagonists of socialism seem able to even approach these questions in a rational manner. One admirably typical critic of a pamphlet in which I propounded exactly the same opinions as are here set out in the 3rd chapter found great comfort in the expression brood mares. He took hold of my phrase, state family, and ran wild with it. He declared it to be my intention that women were no longer to be wives but brood mares for the state. Nothing would convince him that this was a glaring untruth. His mind was essentially equestrian. Human stud farm was another of his expressions. See note 15. Ridicule and argument failed to touch him. I believe he would have gone to the stake to justify his faith that socialists want to put woman in the government horrors. His thick-headedness had indeed a touch of the heroic. Note 15. What makes the expression particularly inappropriate in my case is the fact that in my Mankind in the Making there is a clearly reasoned chapter, Chapter 2, which has never been answered, in which I discuss and, I think, conclusively dispose of Mr. Francis Galton's ideas of eugenics and deliberate stirpiculture. Then a certain Father Phelan of St. Louis, no doubt in a state of mental exaltation as honest as it was indiscriminating, told the world through the columns of an American magazine that I wanted to tear the babe from the mother's breast and thrust it into an institution. He said worse things than that, but I set them aside as pulpit eloquence. Some readers, no doubt, know better and laughed, but many were quite sincerely shocked, and resolved after that to give socialism a very wide berth indeed. Honi soit qui mal y pense. The revolting ideas that disgusted them were not mine. They came from some hot dark reservoir of evil thoughts that years of chastity and discipline seemed to have left intact in Father Phelan's soul. The error in all these cases is the error of overstatement, of getting into a condition of confused intellectual excitement, and because a critic declares your window curtains too blue, saying therefore, and usually with passion, that he wants the whole universe, sky and sea included, painted bright orange. The inquirer into the question of socialism will find that an almost incurable disease of these controversies. Again and again he will meet with it. If after that critic's little proposition about your window curtains he chances to say that on the whole he thinks an orange sky would be unpleasant, the common practice is to accuse him of not sticking to his guns. My friends, Mr. G.K. Chesterton and Mr. Max Beerbohm, those brilliant ornaments of our age, when they chance to write about socialism, confess this universal failing, albeit in a very different quality and measure. They are not, it is true, distressed by that unwashed coal-heaver who haunts the now private bed of the common anti-socialist, nor have they any horrid vision of the fathers of the community being approved by a select committee of the county council, no doubt wrapped in horsecloths and led out by their grooms, such as troubles the spurred and quivering soul of that equestrian, I forget his name, the brood-mare gentleman who denounced me in the Pall Mall Gazette. But their souls fly out in a passion of protest against the hints of discipline and order the advancement of socialism reveals. Mr. G.K. Chesterton mocks valiantly and passionately, I know, against an oppressive and obstinately recurrent anticipation of himself in socialist hands, hair-clipped, meals of a strictly hygienic description at regular hours, a fine for laughing, not that he would want to laugh, and austere exercises in several of the more metallic virtues daily. Mr. Max Beerbohm's conception is rather in the nature of a nightmare, a hopeless, horrid, frozen flight from the pursuit of Mr. Sidney Webb and myself, both of us short, inelegant men indeed, but for all that terribly resolute, indefatigable, incessant, to capture him, drag him off to a mechanical utopia, and there to take his thumb mark and his name, number him distinctly in indelible ink, dress him in an unbecoming uniform, and let him loose, under inspection, in a world of neat round lakes of blue lime water and vistas of white sanitary tiling. The method of reasoning in all these cases is the same. It is to assume that whatever the socialist postulates as desirable is wanted without limit or qualification. To imagine whatever proposal is chosen, for the controversy is to be carried out by uncontrolled monomaniacs, and so to make a picture of the socialist dream. This picture is presented to the simple-minded person in doubt with, "This is socialism. Surely you don't want this." And occasionally the poor, simple-minded person really is overcome by these imagined terrors. He turns back to our dingy realities again, to the good old grimy world he knows, thanking God beyond measure that he will never live to see the hateful day when one baby out of every 4 ceases to die in our manufacturing towns, when lives of sordid care are banished altogether from the earth, and when the sense of humour and the cult of Mark Tapley, which flourishes so among these things, will be in danger of perishing from disuse. But the reader sees now what socialism is in its essentials, the tempered magnificence of the constructive scheme to which it asks him to devote his life. It is a laborious, immense project to make the world a world of social justice, of opportunity and full living, to abolish waste, to abolish the lavish, unpremeditated cruelty of our present social order. Do not let the wit or perversity of the adversary, or, what is often a far worse influence, the zeal and overstatement of the headlong advocate, do not let the manifest personal deficiencies of this spokesman or that distract you from the living heart in socialism, its broad generosity of conception, its immense claim in kinship and direction upon your good will. Part 2. For the convenience of those readers who are in the position of inquirers, I had designed at this point a section which was to contain a list of the chief objections to socialism, other than the mere misrepresentations which are current nowadays. I had meant at first to answer each one fully and gravely, to clear them all up exhaustively and finally before proceeding. But I find now, upon jotting them down, that they are for the most part already anticipated by the preceding chapters, and so I will note them here, very compactly indeed, and make but the briefest comment upon each. There is first the assertion, which effectually bars a great number of people from further inquiry into socialist teaching, that socialism is contrary to Christianity. I would urge that this is the absolute inversion of the truth. Christianity involves, I am convinced, a practical socialism if it is honestly carried out. This is not only my conviction, but the reader, if he is a nonconformist, can find it set out at length by Dr. Clifford in a Fabian tract, Socialism and the Teaching of Christ, and if a churchman, by the Reverend Stuart Headlam in another, Christian Socialism. He will find a longer and fuller discussion of this question in the Reverend R. J. Campbell's Christianity and Social Order. In the list of members of such a socialist society as the Fabian Society will be found the names of clergy of the principal Christian dominations, excepting only the Roman Catholic Church. It is said, indeed, that a good Catholic of the Roman Communion cannot also be any sort of socialist. Even this very general persuasion may not be correct. I believe the papal prohibition was originally aimed entirely at a specific form of socialism, the socialism of Marx, Engels, and Bebel, which is, I must admit, unfortunately strongly anti-Christian in tone, as is the socialism of the British Social Democratic Federation to this day. It is true that many leaders of the Socialist Party have also been secularists, and that they have mingled their theological prejudices with their political work. This is the case not only in Germany and America, but in Great Britain, where Mr. Robert Blatchford of the Clarion, for example, has also carried on a campaign against doctrinal Christianity. But this association of secularism and socialism is only the inevitable throwing together of two sets of ideas because they have this in common, that they run counter to generally received opinions. There is no other connection. Many prominent secularists, like Charles Bradlaugh and Mr. J. M. Robertson, are as emphatically anti-socialist as the Pope. Secularists and socialists get thrown together and classed together just as early Christians and criminals and rebels against the emperor were no doubt thrown together in Roman jails. They had this much in common, that they were in conflict with what most people considered to be right. It is a confusion that needs constant explaining away. It is to me a most lamentable association of two entirely separate thought processes, one constructive socially and the other destructive intellectually, and I have already, in Chapter 6, Part 4, done my best to disavow it. Socialism is pure materialism. It seeks only physical well-being, just as much as nursing lepers for pity and the love of God is pure materialism that seeks only physical well-being. Socialism advocates free love. This objection I have also disposed of in Chapter 6, Part 2 and 4. Socialism renders love impossible and reduces humanity to the condition of a stud farm. This too has already been dealt with. See Chapter 3, Part 2 and 5, and Chapter 6, Part 2, 3 and 4. These two objections generally occur together in the same anti-socialist speech or tract. Socialism would destroy parental responsibility. This absurd perversion is altogether disposed of in Chapter 6, Part 3. It is a direct inversion of current socialist teaching. Part 3. Socialism would open the way to vast public corruption. This is flatly opposed to the experience of America, where local administration has been as little socialistic and as corrupt as anywhere in the world. Obviously, in order that a public official should be bribed, there must be some wealthy person outside the system to bribe him, and with an interest in bribing him. When you have a weak administration with feeble powers and resources and strong unscrupulous private corporations seeking to override the law and public welfare, the possibilities of bribing are at the highest point. In a community given over to the pursuit of gain, powerful private enterprises will resort to corruption to get and protract franchises, to evade penalties and postpone expropriation, and they will do it systematically and successfully. And even where there is partial public enterprise and a competition among contractors, there will certainly be, at least, attempts at corruption to get contracts. But where the whole process is in public hands, where can the bribery creep in? Who is going to find the money for the bribes, and why? It is urged that in another direction there is likely to be a corruption of public life due to the organized voting of the employees in this branch of the public service or that, seeking some advantage for their own service. This is Lord Avebury's bogey. See Note 16. Frankly, such voting by services is highly probable. The tramway men or the milk service men may think they are getting too long hours or too low pay in comparison with the teachers or men on the ocean liners, and the thing may affect elections. That is only human nature, and the point to bear in mind is that this sort of thing goes on today, and goes on with a vigour out of all proportion to the mild possibilities of a socialist regime. The landowners of Great Britain, for example, are organized in the most formidable manner against the general interests of the community, and constantly subordinate the interests of the common weal to their conception of justice to their class. The big railways are equally potent, and so are the legal profession and the brewers. But today, these political interventions of great organized services athwart the path of statesmanship are sustained by enormous financial resources. The state employees under socialism will be in the position of employing one another and paying one another. The teacher, for example, will be educating the sons of the tramwaymen up to the requirements of the public paymaster, and travelling in the trams to and from his work. There will be close mutual observation and criticism, therefore, and a strong community of spirit, and that will put very definite limits indeed upon the possibly evil influence of class and service interests in politics. Note 16. On Municipal and National Trading by Lord Avebury, Macmillan and Co., 1907. Socialism would destroy incentive and efficiency. This is dealt with in Chapter 5, on the spirit of gain and the spirit of service. Socialism is economically unsound. The student of socialism who studies, and every student of socialism should study very carefully, the literature directed against socialism, will encounter a number of rather confused and frequently very confusing arguments running upon business or economic lines. In nearly all of these, the root error is a misconception of the nature and the aim of socialist claims. Sometimes this misconception is stated and manifest, often it is subtly implied, and then it presents the greatest difficulties to the inexpert dialectician. I find, for instance, Mr. W. H. Lever, in an article on socialism and business in the Magazine of Commerce for October 1907, assuming that there will be no increase in the total wealth of the community under socialism, whereas, as my 4th chapter shows, socialist proposals in the matter of property aim directly at the cessation of the waste occasioned by competition through the duplication and multiplication of material and organizations, see for example the quotation from Elihu, page 69, and at the removal of the obstructive claims of private ownership, see page 65, from the path of production. If socialism does not increase the total wealth of the community, socialism is impossible. Having made this assumption, however, Mr. Lever next assumes that all contemporary business is productive of honest, needed commodities, and that its public utility and its profitable conduct measure one another. But this ignores the manifest fact that success in business nowadays is far more often won by the mere salesmanship of mediocre or inferior or short-weight goods than it is by producing exceptional value, and the Kentish railways, for example, are a standing contrast of the conflict between public service and private profit-seeking. But having committed himself to these entirely unsound assumptions, it is easy for Mr. Lever to show that since socialism will give no more wealth, and since what he calls labour, capital, and the employer, i.e. labour, plant, and management, are necessary to production and must be maintained out of the total product, there will be little more, practically, for the labourer under socialist conditions than under the existing regime. Going on further to assume that the owner is always enterprising and intelligent and public-spirited, and the state stupid, which is a quite unjustifiable assumption, he shows their share may be even less. But the whole case for the socialist proposals, the student must bear in mind, rests upon the recognition that private management of our collective concerns means chaotic and socially wasteful management. however efficient it may be in individual cases for competitive purposes, and that the systematic abolition of the parasitic owner from our economic process implies the replacement of confusion by order and an immense increase in the efficiency of that economic process. Socialism is economy. If the student of socialism does not bear this in mind, if once he allows the assumption to creep in that socialism is not so much a proposal to change, concentrate and organize the economic process as one to distributing the existing wealth of the country in some new manner, he will find there is a bad case for socialism. It is an amusing and I think a fair comment on the arguments of Mr. Lever that a year or so ago he was actually concerned, no doubt in the interests of the public as well as his own, in organizing the production and distribution of soap so as to economize the waste and avoid the public disservice due to the extreme competition of the soap dealers. He wanted to do in the soap industry just exactly what socialism wants to do in the case of all public services. That is to say, he wanted to give it the economic advantages of a great combine. In some directions, the saving to the soap interest would have been immense. All the vast expenditure upon newspaper advertisements, for example, all the waste upon competing travellers would have been saved. Whether the public would have benefited greatly or not is beside the present question. Mr. Lever and other great soap proprietors would certainly have benefited enormously. They would have benefited by working as a collective interest instead of as independent private owners. But in this little experiment, in what was really a sort of voluntary socialism for particular ends, Mr. Lever reckoned without another great system of private adventurers, the halfpenny newspaper proprietors, who had hitherto been drawing large sums from soap advertisement, and who had in fact been so far parasitic on the public soap supply. One group of these papers at once began a campaign against the Soap Trust, a campaign almost as noisy and untruthful as the anti-socialist campaign. They accused Mr. Lever of nearly every sort of cheating that can be done by a soap seller, and anticipated every sort of oppression a private monopolist can practice. In the end, they paid unprecedented damages for libel, but they stopped Mr. Lever's intelligent and desirable endeavours to replace the waste and disorder of our existing soap supply by a simple and more efficient organization. Mr. Lever cannot have forgotten these facts. They were surely in the back of his mind when he wrote his Socialism and Business paper, and it is a curious instance of the unconscious limitations one may encounter in a mind of exceptional ability that he could not bring them forward and apply them to the problem in hand. Socialism is unbusinesslike. See Chapter 8, Part 2 and 3. Part 4. Socialism would destroy freedom. This is a more considerable difficulty. To begin with, it may be necessary to remind the reader that absolute freedom is an impossibility, as I have written in my Modern Utopia. The idea of individual liberty is one that has grown in importance and grows with every development of modern thought. To the classical utopists, freedom was relatively trivial. Clearly, they considered virtue and happiness as entirely separable from liberty and as being altogether more important things. But the modern view, with its deepening insistence upon individuality and upon the significance of its uniqueness, steadily intensifies the value of freedom until at last we begin to see liberty as the very substance of life, that indeed it is life, and that only the dead things, the choiceless things, live in absolute obedience to law. To have free play for one's individuality is, in the modern view, the subjective triumph of existence, as survival in creative work and offspring is its objective triumph. But for all men, since man is a social creature, the play of will must fall short of absolute freedom. Perfect human liberty is possible only to a despot, who is absolutely and universally obeyed. Then to will would be to command and achieve, and within the limits of natural law, we could at any moment do exactly as it pleased us to do. All other liberty is a compromise between our own freedom of will and the wills of those with whom we come in contact. In an organized state, each one of us has a more or less elaborate code of what he may do to others and to himself, and what others may do to him. He limits others by his rights and is limited by the rights of others and by considerations affecting the welfare of the community as a whole. Individual liberty in a community is not, as mathematicians would say, always of the same sign. To ignore this is the essential fallacy of the cult called individualism. But in truth, a general prohibition in a state may increase the sum of liberty, and a general permission may diminish it. It does not follow, as these people would have us believe, that a man is more free where there is least law, and more restricted where there is most law. A socialism or a communism is not necessarily a slavery, and there is no freedom under anarchy. It follows, therefore, in a modern utopia, which finds the final hope of the world in the evolving interplay of unique individualities, that the state will have effectually chipped away just all those spendthrift liberties that waste liberty, and not one liberty more, and so have attained the maximum general freedom. That is the gist of the socialist's answer to this accusation. He asks, what freedom is there today for the vast majority of mankind? They are free to do nothing but work for a bare subsistence all their lives. They may not go freely about the earth even, but are prosecuted for trespassing upon the health-giving breast of our universal mother. Consider the clerks and girls who hurry to their work of a morning across Brooklyn Bridge in New York, or Hungerford Bridge in London. Go and see them, study their faces. They are free, with a freedom socialism would destroy. Consider the poor painted girls who pursue bread with nameless indignities through our streets at night. They are free by the current standard. And the poor half-starved wretches struggling with the impossible stint of oakum in a casual ward, they too are free. The nimble footman is free, the crushed porter between the trucks is free, the woman in the mill, the child in the mine. Ask them. They will tell you how free they are. They have happened to choose these ways of living, that is all. No doubt the piquancy of the life attracts them in many such cases. Let us be frank. A form of socialism might conceivably exist without much freedom, with hardly more freedom than that of a British worker today. A state socialism tyrannized over by officials who might be almost as bad at times as uncontrolled small employers is so far possible that in Germany it is practically half-existent now. A bureaucratic socialism might conceivably be a state of affairs scarcely less detestable than our own. I will not deny there is a clear necessity of certain addenda to the wider formulae of socialism if we are to be safeguarded effectually from the official. We need free speech, free discussion, free publication as essentials for a wholesome socialist state. How they be maintained I shall discuss in a later chapter. But these admissions do not justify the present system. Socialism, though it failed to give us freedom, would not destroy anything that we have in this way. We want freedom now, and we have it not. We speak of freedom of speech, but today, in innumerable positions, socialist employees who declared their opinions openly would be dismissed. Then again, in religious questions, there is an immense amount of intolerance and suppression of social and religious discussion today, especially in our English villages. As for freedom of action, most of us, from 14 to the grave, are chased from even the leisure to require freedom by the necessity of earning a living. Socialism, as I have stated it thus far, and as it is commonly stated, would give economic liberty to men and women alike. It would save them from the cruel urgency of need, and so far it would enormously enlarge freedom. But it does not guarantee them political or intellectual liberty. That I frankly admit and accept as one of the incompletenesses of contemporary socialism. I conceive, therefore, as I shall explain at length in a later chapter, that it is necessary to supplement such socialism as is currently received by certain new propositions. But to admit that socialism does not guarantee freedom is not to admit that socialism will destroy it. It is possible, given certain conditions, for men to be nearly absolutely free in speech, in movement, in conduct. Enormously free, that is, as compared with our present conditions, in a socialist state established upon the two great propositions I have formulated in chapters 3 and 4. So that the statement that socialism will destroy freedom is a baseless one of no value as a general argument against the socialist idea. Part 5. Socialism would reduce life to one monotonous dead level. This is in a world which the majority of people live in cheap cottages, villa residences, and tenement houses, read halfpenny newspapers, and wear ready-made clothes. Socialism would destroy art, invention, and literature. I do not know why this objection is made, unless it be that the objectors suppose that artists will not create, inventors will not think, and no one write or sing except to please a wealthy patron. Without his opulent smile, where would they be? Well, do not let us be ungrateful. The arts owe much to patronage. Go to Venice, go to Florence, and you will find a glorious harvest of pictures and architecture sown and reaped by a mercantile plutocracy. But then, in Rome, in Athens, you will find an equal accumulation made under very different conditions. Reach a certain phase of civilization, a certain leisure and wealth, and art will out, however the wealth may be distributed. In certain sumptuous directions, art flourishes now, and would certainly flourish less in a socialist state. In the gear of ostentatious luxury, in private furniture of all sorts, in palace building, in the exquisite confections of costly feminine adornment, in the luxurious binding of books, in the cooking of larks, in the distinguished portraiture of undistinguished persons, in the various refinements of prostitution, in the subtle accommodations of mystic theology, in jewellery. It is quite conceivable that in such departments socialism will discourage and limit aesthetic and intellectual effort. But how plutocracy could ever have produced a Gothic cathedral, a folklore, a gracious natural type of cottage, or beautiful clothing for the common people? And no mercantile plutocracy will ever tolerate a literature of power. If the coming of socialism destroys arts, it will also create arts. The architecture of private palaces will give place to an architecture of beautiful common homes, cottages, and colleges, and to a splendid development of public buildings. The sergeants of socialism will paint famous people instead of millionaires' wives. Poetry and popular romantic literature will revive. For my own part, I have no doubt where the balance of advantage lies. It seems reasonable to look to the literary and artistic people themselves for a little guidance in this matter. Well, we had in the 19th century an absolute revolt of artists against individualism. The proportion of open and declared socialists among the great writers, artists, playwrights, critics of the Victorian period was out of all proportion to the number of socialists in the general population. Wilde, in his Soul of Man under Socialism, Ruskin, in many volumes of imperishable prose, Morris, in all his later life, have witnessed to the unending protest of the artistic spirit against the rule of gain. Some of these writers are not, perhaps, to be regarded as orthodox socialists in the modern sense, but their disgust with and contempt for individualist competition is entirely in the vein of our teaching. Even this individualistic country of ours, after the shameful shock of the Great Exhibition of 1851, decided that it could no longer leave art to private enterprise, and organized that systematic government art teaching that has, in spite of its many defects, revolutionized the aesthetic quality of this country. And so far as research and invention go, one may very reasonably appeal to such an authority on the other side as the late Mr. Beat of Warner Beat & Co. The outcome of his experience as an individualist financier was to convince him that the only way to raise the standard of technical science in England, and therewith of economic enterprise, was by the endowment of public teaching, and the huge London Charlottenburg rises out of his conviction. Even Messrs. Rockefeller and Carnegie admit the failure of individualism in this matter by pouring money into public universities and public libraries. All these heads of the commercial process confess by such acts just exactly what this objection of the inexperienced denies. That is to say, the power of the state to develop art, invention, and knowledge. The necessity that this duty should be done, if not by, then at any rate through the state. Socialism may very seriously change the direction of intellectual and aesthetic endeavour. That one admits. But there is no reason whatever for supposing it will not, and there are countless reasons for supposing that it will enormously increase the opportunities and encouragements for aesthetic and intellectual endeavour. Part 6. Socialism would arrest the survival of the fittest. Here is an objection from quite a new quarter. It is the stock objection of the science student. Hitherto we have considered religious and aesthetic difficulties, but this is the difficulty of the mind that realizes clearly the nature of the biological process, the secular change in every species under the influence of its environment, and is most concerned with that. Species, it is said, change, and the student of the elements of science is too apt to conclude that this change is always ascent in the scale of being, by the killing off of the individuals out of harmony with the circumstances under which the species is living. This is not quite true. The truer statement is that species change because, allowing for chance and individual exceptions, only those individuals survive to reproduce themselves who are fairly well adjusted to the conditions of life, so that in each generation there is only a small portion of births out of harmony with these conditions. This sounds very like the previous proposition, but it differs in this, that the accent is shifted from the killing to the suppression of births, That is the really important fact. In any case, then, the believer in evolution holds that the qualities encouraged by the environment increase in the species, and the qualities discouraged diminish. The qualities that have survival value are not always what we human beings consider admirable. That is a consideration many science students fail to grasp. The remarkable habits of all the degenerating crustacea, for example, the appetite of the vulture, the unpleasing personality of the common hyena, all that less charming side of Mother Nature that her scandalized children may read in Cobbold's Human Parasites, are the result of survival under the pressure of environment, just as much as the human eye or the wing of an eagle. Let the objector therefore ask himself what sort of fittest are surviving now. The plain answer is that under our present conditions, the breeding getter wins, the man who can hold and keep and reproduce his kind. People with the instinct of owning stronger than any other instinct float out upon the top of our seething mass and flourish there. Aggressive, intensely acquisitive, reproductive people, the ignoble sort of Jew is the very type of it, are the people who will prevail in a social system based on private property and mercantile competition. No creative power, no nobility, no courage can battle against them. And below, in the slums and factories, what will be going on? The survival of a race of stunted toilers, with great resisting power to infection, contagion and fatigue, omnivorous as rats. Don't imagine that the high infantile death rate of our manufacturing centres spares the fine big children. It does not. Here is the effectual answer to that. It is taken from the report of the Education Committee of the London County Council for the year 1905. And it is part of an account of an inquiry conducted by the headmaster of one school in a poor neighbourhood. The object of the inquiry was to discover the causes of variation in the physical condition of children within the limits of this single school. Each of the 405 boys was carefully weighed and measured without boots. A note was made of the condition of the teeth, and a general estimate of the personal cleanliness and sufficiency of clothing as a basis for determining the home conditions of neglect or otherwise from external evidence. The teacher of each class added an estimate of mental capacity. Here follow tabular arrangements of results and height and weight charts. It may be noted in the heights and weights for each age that the curve is not a continuous line of growth, but that at some ages it springs nearer to, and at the other sinks further from the normal. The greatest effect upon the life capital of the population is produced by the infantile mortality, which in some years actually kills off during the first year 1 in 5 of all children born. The question naturally arises, what is its effect upon the survivors? Do the weakly ones get killed off, and only the strong muddle through? Or does the adverse environment, which slaughters 1 in 5, have a maiming effect upon those left? When the infantile mortality for the parish in which the school is situate was charted above the physique curve, an absolute correspondent is to be observed. The children born in a year when infantile mortality is low show an increased physique, rising nearest to the normal in the extraordinary good year 1892, and those born in the years of high mortality show a decreased physique. It appears certain, therefore, that in the years of high infantile mortality the conditions to which 1 in 5 or 6 of the children born are sacrificed, having a maiming effect upon the other 4 or 5. The fine big children are born in periods of low infantile mortality. That is the essential point. So that anyhow, since the fittest under present conditions is manifestly the rat-like, the survival of the fittest that is going on now is one that is highly desirable to stop as soon as possible, and so far socialism will arrest the survival of the fittest. But that does not mean that it will stop the development of the species altogether. It will merely shift the incident of selection and rejection to a new set of qualities. I think I have already hinted, Chapter 6, Part 2, that a state that undertakes to sustain all the children born into it will do its best to secure good births. That implies a distinct bar to the marriage and reproduction of the halt and the blind, the bearers of transmissible diseases and the like. And women, being economically independent, will have a far freer choice in wedlock than they have now. Now they must in practice marry men who can more or less keep them. They must subordinate every other consideration to that. Under socialism, they will certainly look less to a man's means and acquisitive gifts, and more to the finer qualities of his personality. They will prefer prominent men, able men, fine, vigorous, and attractive persons. There will, indeed, be far more freedom of choice on either side than under the sordid conditions of the present time. I submit that such a free choice is far more likely to produce a secular increase in the beauty, the intellectual and physical activity and the capacity of the race than our present haphazard mercenariness. The science student will be interested to read in this connection The Ethic of Free Thought, A&C Black, 1888, Socialism in Theory and Practice, 1884, and The Chances of Death and Other Studies in Evolution, Arnold, 1897, by Carl Pearson. Professor Pearson is not in all respects to be taken as an authoritative exponent of modern socialism, and he is associated with no socialist organization, but his treatment of the biological aspect is that of a specialist and a master. Part 7. Socialism is against human nature. This objection I have left until last because, firstly, it is absolutely true, and secondly, it leads naturally to the newer ideas that have already peeped out once or twice in my earlier chapters, and which will now ride up to a predominance in what follows, and, particularly, the idea that an educational process and a moral discipline are not only a necessary part, but the most fundamental part of any complete socialist scheme. Socialism is against human nature. That is true, and it is equally true of everything else. Capitalism is against human nature. Competition is against human nature. Cruelty, kindness, religion and doubt, monogamy, polygamy, celibacy, decency, indecency, piety and sin are all against human nature. The present system in particular is against human nature. Or what is the policeman for, the soldier, the debt collector, the judge, the hangman? What means the glass along my neighbour's wall? Human nature is against human nature, for human nature is in a perpetual conflict. It is the Ishmael of the universe, against everything and with everything against it, and within no more and no less than a perpetual battleground of passion, desire, cowardice, indolence, and goodwill. So that our initial proposition, as it stands at the head of this section, is as an argument against socialism, just worth nothing at all. None the less valuable is it as a reminder of the essential constructive task of which the two primary generalizations of socialism we have so far been developing are but the outward and visible forms. There is no untutored naturalness in socialism, no uneducated blind force on our side. Socialism is made of struggling goodwill, made out of a conflict of wills. I have tried to let it become apparent that for a while I do firmly believe not only in the splendour and nobility of the socialist dream, but in its ultimate practicality. I do also recognise quite clearly that with people just as they are now, with their prejudices, their ignorances, their misapprehensions, their unchecked vanities and greeds and jealousies, their crude and misguided instincts, their irrational traditions, no socialist state can exist, no better state can exist than the one we have now with all its squalor and cruelty. Every change in human institutions must happen concurrently with a change of ideas. Upon this plastic, uncertain, teachable thing, human nature, within us and without, we have, if we really contemplate socialism as our achievement, to impose guiding ideas and guiding habits, we have to coordinate all the goodwill that is active or latent in our world in one constructive plan. Today, the spirit of humanity is lost to itself, divided, dispersed, and hidden in little narrow distorted circles of thought. These divided, misshapen circles of thought are not human nature, but human nature has fallen into these forms and has to be released. Our fundamental business is to develop the human spirit. It is in the enlargement and enrichment of the average circle of thought that the essential work and method of socialism is to be found. Chapter 10. Socialism, a Developing Doctrine. Part 1. So far, we have been discussing the broad elementary propositions of modern socialism. As we have dealt with them, they amount to little more than a sketch of the foundation for a great scheme of social reconstruction. It would be a poor service to socialism to pretend that this scheme is complete. From this point onward, one enters upon a series of less unanimous utterances and more questionable suggestions. Concerning much of what follows, socialism has as yet not elaborated its teaching. It has to do so. It is doing so. But huge labours lie before its servants. Before it can achieve any full measure of realization, it has to overcome problems at present but half solved, problems at present scarcely touched, the dark, unsettling suggestion of problems that still await formulation. The anti-socialist is freely welcome to all these admissions. No doubt they will afford grounds for some cheap transitory triumph. They affect our great generalizations not at all. They detract nothing from the fact that socialism presents the most inspiring, creative scheme that ever came into the chaos of human affairs. The fact that it is not cut and dried, that it lives and grows, that every honest adherent adds not only to its forces, but to its thought and spirit, is itself inspiration. The new adherent to socialism in particular must bear this in mind, that socialism is no garment made and finished that we can reasonably ask the world to wear forthwith. It is not that its essentials remain in doubt. It is not that it does not stand for things supremely true, but that its proper method and its proper expedients have still to be established. Over and above the propaganda of its main constructive ideas and the political work for their more obvious and practical application, an immense amount of intellectual work remains to be done for socialism. The battle for socialism is to be fought not simply at the polls and in the marketplace, but at the writing desk and in the study. Too many questions, the attitude of socialism today is one of confessed inquiring imperfection. See Note 17. It would indeed be very remarkable if a proposition for changes so vast and comprehensive as socialism advances was in any different state at this present time. Note 17. The student will find very clear, informing and suggestive reading in Kirkup's History of Socialism, A and C Black, 1906. It is a fine, impartial account of these developments, which may well be used as a corrective or confirmation of this book. It is so recently as 1833 that the world first heard the word socialism. See Note 18. It appeared then with the vaguest implications and the most fluctuating definition, as a general term for a disconnected series of protests against the extreme theories of individualism and individualist political economy, against the cruel, race-destroying industrial spirit that then dominated the world. Of these protests, the sociological suggestions and experiments of Robert Owen were most prominent in the English community, and he it is, more than any other single person, whom we must regard as the father of socialism. But in France, ideas essentially similar were appearing about such movements and personalities as those of Saint Simon, Proudhon, and Fourier. They were part of a vast system of questionings and repudiations, political doubts, social doubts, hesitating inquiries, and experiments. Note 18. It was probably first used in the Poor Man's Guardian in that year. See The Life of Francis Place by Graham Wallace, page 353. It is only to be expected that early socialism should now appear as not only an extremely imperfect but a very inconsistent system of proposals. Its value lay not so much in its plans as in its hopeful and confident denials. It had hold of one great truth. It moved one great amendment to the conception of practical equality the French Revolution had formulated, and that was its clear indication of the evil of unrestricted private property and of the necessary antagonism of the interests of the individual to the common weal, of wealth against commonwealth, that went with that. Whilst most men had to go propertyless in a world that was privately owned, the assertion of equality was an empty lie. For the rest, primordial socialism was entirely sketchy and experimental. It was wild as the talk of schoolboys. It disregarded the most obvious needs. It did not provide for any principle of government, or for the maintenance of collective thought and social determination. It offered no safeguards and guarantees for even the most elementary privacies and freedoms. It was extraordinarily non-constructive. It was extreme in its proposed abolition of the home, and it flatly ignored the huge process of transition needed for a change so profound and universal. The early socialism was immediately millennial. It had no patience. The idea was to be made into a definite project forthwith. Fourier drew up his compact scheme, arranged how many people should live in each flange, and so forth. And all that remained to do, he thought, was to sow phalanges as one scatters poppy seed. With him it was to be socialism by contagion. With many of his still hastier contemporaries, it was to be socialism by proclamation. All the evils of society were to crumble to ruins like the walls of Jericho at the first onset of the great idea. Our present generation is less buoyant, perhaps, but wiser. However young you may be as a reformer, you know you must face certain facts those early socialists ignored. Whatever sort of community you dream of, you realize that it has to be made up of the sort of people you meet every day, or of the children growing up under their influence. The damping words of the old philosopher to the ardent social reformer of 17 were really the quintessence of our criticism of revolutionary socialism. Will your aunts join us, my dear? No? Well, is the grocer on our side, and the family solicitor? We shall have to provide for them all, you know, unless you suggest a lethal chamber. For a generation, socialism, in the exaltation of its self-discovery, failed to measure these primary obstacles, failed to recognize the real necessity, the quality of the task of making these people understand. To this day, the majority of socialists still fail to grasp completely the Herbartian truth, the fact that every human soul moves within its circle of ideas, resisting enlargement, incapable indeed, if once it is adult, of any extensive enlargement, and that all effectual human progress can be achieved only through such enlargement. Only ideas cognate to a circle of ideas are assimilated or assimilable. Ideas too alien, though you shout them in the ear, thrust them in the face, remain foreign and incomprehensible. The early socialists, arriving at last at their great idea after toilsome questionings, after debates, disputations, studies, trials, saw and instantly couldn't understand those others who did not see. They failed altogether to realize the leaps they had made, the brilliant omissions they had achieved, the difficulties they had evaded to get to this magnificent conception. I suppose such impatience is as natural and understandable as it is unfortunate. None of us escape it. Much of this early socialism is as unreal as mathematics, has much the same relation to truth as the abstract absolute process of calculation has to concrete individual things. Much of it more than justifies altogether that black or white method of criticism of which I wrote in the preceding chapter. They were as downright and unconsidering, as little capable as the reasoned middle attitude. Proudhon, perceiving that the world was obsessed by a misconception of the scope of property whereby the many were enslaved to the few, went off at a tangent to the announcement that property is robbery, an exaggeration that, as I have already shown, still haunts socialist discussion. The ultimate factor of all human affairs, the psychological factor, was disregarded. Like the classic mathematical problem, early socialism was always neglecting the weight of the elephant, or some other, from the practical point of view, equally essential factor. This was, perhaps, an unavoidable stage. It is probable that by no other means than such exaggeration and partial statement could socialism have got itself begun. The world of 1830 was fatally wrong in its ideas of property. Early socialism rose up and gave those ideas a flat, extreme, outrageous contradiction. After that, analysis and discussion became possible. The early socialist literature teems with rash, suggestive schemes. It has the fertility, the confusion, the hopefulness, the promise of glowing youth. It is a quarry of ideas, a mine of crude expedients, a fountain of emotions. The abolition of money, the substitution of labor notes, the possibility, justice and advantage of equalizing upon a time basis the remuneration of the worker, the relation of the new community to the old family. 100 such topics were ventilated, were not so much ventilated as tossed about in an impassioned gale. Much of this earlier socialist literature was like Cabott's book, actually utopian in form. A still larger proportion was utopian in spirit. Its appeal was imaginative, and it aimed to be a plan of a new state as definite and detailed as the plan for the building of a house. It has been the fashion, with a number of later socialist writers and speakers, mind-struck with that blessed word evolution, confusing scientific, a popular epithet to which they aspired, with unimaginative, to sneer at the utopian method, to make a sort of ideal of a leaden practicality. But it does not follow, because the utopias produced and the experiments attempted were in many aspects unreasonable and absurd, that the method itself is an unsound one. At a certain phase of every creative effort, you must cease to study the thing that is and plan the thing that is not. The early socialisms were only premature plans and hasty working models that failed to work. And it must be remembered, when we consider socialism's early extravagancies, that any idea or system of ideas which challenges the existing system is necessarily, in relation to that system, outcast. Mediocre men go soberly on the high roads, but saints and scoundrels meet in the jails. If A and B rebel against the government, they are apt, although they rebel for widely different reasons, to be classed together. They are apt, indeed, to be thrown together and tempted to sink even quite essential differences in making common cause against the enemy. So that, from its very beginning, socialism was mixed up. To this day, it remains mixed up with other movements of revolt and criticism with which it has no very natural connection. There is, for example, the unfortunate entanglement between the socialist theory and the repudiation of any but subjective sexual limitations which is called free love, and there is still more unfortunate association of its rebellion against orthodox economic theories, with rebellion against this or that system of religious teaching. Several of the early socialist communities, again, rebelled against the ordinary clothing, and their women made short hair and bloomers the outward and visible associations of the communistic idea. In Holyoake's History of Cooperation, it is stated that one early experiment was known to its neighbours as the grass-eating atheists of Ham Common. I have done my very best, in Chapter 8, Part 2, to clear the exposition of socialism from these entanglements. But it is well to recognize that these are no corruptions of its teaching, but an inevitable birth infection that is still to be completely overcome. Part 2. The comprehensively constructive spirit of modern socialism is very much to seek in these childhood phases that came before Marx. These early projects were for the most part developed by literary men, and by one philosophic businessman, Owen, to whose circle of ideas the conception of state organization and administration was foreign. They took peace and order for granted. They left out the schoolmaster, the judge, and the policeman, as the amateur architect of the anecdote left out the staircase. They set out to contrive a better industrial organization, or a better social atmosphere within the present scheme of things. They wished to reform what they understood, and what was outside their circle of ideas they took for granted, as they took the sky and sea. Not only was their literature utopian literature about little islands of things begun over again from the beginning, but their activities tended in the direction of utopian experiments equally limited and isolated. Here again, a just critic will differ from many contemporary socialists in their depreciation of this sort of work. Owen's experiments in socialized production were of enormous educational and scientific value. They were, to use a mining expert's term, hand specimens of human welfare of the utmost value to promoters. They made factory legislation possible. They initiated the now immense cooperative movement. They stirred commonplace imaginations as only achievement can stir them. They set going a process of amelioration in industrial conditions that will never, I believe, cease again until the socialist state is attained. But apart from Owen and the general advertisement given to socialist ideas, it must be admitted that a great majority of socialist communities have, by every material standard, failed rather than succeeded. Some went visibly insolvent and to pieces. Others were changed by prosperity. Some were wrecked by the sudden lapse of the treasurer into an extreme individualism. Essentially, socialism is a project for the species, but these communities made it a system of relationships within a little group. To the world without, they had necessarily to turn a competitive face, to buy and sell and advertise on the lines of the system as it is. If they failed, they failed. If they succeeded, they presently found themselves landlords, employers, no more and no less than a corporate individualism. I have described elsewhere, see Note 19, the fate of the celebrated Oneida community of New York State, and how it is now converted into an aggressive, wealthy, fighting corporation of the most modern type, employing immigrant labor. Note 19. The Future in America, Chapman and Hall, 1906. Professed and conscious socialism in its early stages, then, was an altogether extreme proposition. It was at once imperfect and over-emphatic, and it was confused with many quite irrelevant and inconsistent novelties with regard to diet, dress, medicine, and religion. Its first manifest, acknowledged and labelled fruits were a series of futile communities. Noyes's History of American Socialisms gives their simple history of births and of fatal infantile ailments. Brook Farm, Fourierite, Phalanges, and the like. But correlated with these extreme efforts, drawing ideas and inspiration from them, was the great philanthropic movement for the amelioration of industrialism that was, I insist, for all its absence of a definite socialist label in many cases, an equally legitimate factor in the making of the great conception of modern socialism. Socialism may be the child of the French Revolution, but it certainly has one aristocratic Tory grandparent. There can be little dispute of the close connection of Lord Shaftesbury's Factory Acts, that commencement of constructive statesmanship in industrialism, with the work of Owen. The whole Victorian period marks a steady development of social organisation out of the cruel economic anarchy of its commencement, the beginnings of public education, adulteration acts, and similar checks upon the extremities of private enterprise, the great successful experiments of cooperative consumers' associations, and the development of what has now become a quasi-official representation of labour in the state through the trade unions. Two great writers, Carlyle and Ruskin, the latter a professed socialist, spent their powers in a relentless campaign against the harsh theories of the liberty of property, the gloomy superstitions of political economy that barred the way to any effectual constructive scheme. An enormous work was done throughout the whole Victorian period by socialists and socialistic writers, in criticising and modifying the average circle of ideas, in bringing conceptions that had once seemed weird, outcast, and altogether fantastic, more and more within the range of acceptable practicality. The first early socialisms were most various and eccentric upon the question of government and control. They had no essential political teaching. Many, but by no means all, were inspired by the democratic idealism of the first French Revolution. They believed in a mystical something that was wiser and better than any individual. The people, the common man. But that was by no means the case with all of them. The noise community was a sort of theocratic autocracy. The Saint Simonian tendency was aristocratic. The English socialism that in the Middle Victorian period developed partly out of the suggestions of Owen's beginnings and partly as an independent fresh outpouring of the struggling goodwill in man. That English socialism that found a voice in Ruskin and in Morris and Kingsley and the Christian socialists was certainly not democratic. It kept much of what was best in the public spirit of contemporary English life, and it implied, if it did not postulate, a governing class. Benevolent and even generous in conception, its exponents betray all too often the ties of social habituations, the limited circle of ideas of English upper and upper middle class life, easy and cultivated, well served and distinctly, not unmistakably, authoritative. While the experimental utopian socialisms gave a sort of variegated and conflicting pattern of reorganized industrialism, and, incidentally to that, a new heaven and earth, the benevolent socialism, socialistic liberalism, and socialistic philanthropy of the Middle Victorian period really went very little further in effect than a projected amelioration and moralization of the relations of rich and poor. It needed the impact of an entirely new type of mind before socialism began to perceive its own significance as an ordered scheme for the entire reconstruction of the world, began to realize the gigantic breadth of its implications. Chapter 11. Revolutionary Socialism. Part 1. It was Karl Marx who brought the second great influx of suggestion into the intellectual process of socialism. Before his time, there does not seem to have been any clear view of economic relationships as having laws of development, as having interactions that began and went on and led towards new things. But Marx had a vision. He had, as Darwin and the evolutionists had, as most men with a scientific training and many educated men without that advantage now have, a sense of secular change. Instead of being content with the accepted picture of the world as a scene where men went on producing and distributing wealth and growing rich or poor, it might be for endless ages, he made an appeal to history and historical analogies, and for the first time viewed our age of individualist industrial development not as a possibly permanent condition of humanity, but as something unstable and in motion, as an economic process, that is to say, with a beginning, a middle, and, as he saw it, an almost inevitable end. The last thing men contrive to discern in every question is the familiar obvious, and it came as a great and shattering discovery to the economic and sociological thought of the latter half of the 19th century that there was going on not simply a production, but an immense concentration of wealth, a differentiation of a special wealthy class of landholder and capitalist, a diminution of small property owners, and the development of a great and growing class of landless, nearly propertyless men, the proletariat. Marx showed, he showed so clearly that today it is recognized by every intelligent man, that given a continuance of our industrial and commercial system, of uncontrolled gain-seeking, that is, given a continuance of our present spirit and ideas of property, there must necessarily come a time when the owner and the proletarian will stand face to face, with nothing, if we accept a middle class of educated professionals dependent on the wealthy, who are after no more than the upper stratum of the proletariat, to mask or mitigate their opposition. We shall have two classes, the class-conscious worker and the class-conscious owner, and they will be at war. And with a broad intellectual sweep, he flung the light of this conception upon the whole contemporary history of mankind. Das Kapital was no sketch of utopias, had no limitation to the conditions or possibilities of this country or that. Here, he says, in the widest way, is what is going on all over the world. So long as practically untrammeled private property, such as you conceive it today, endures, this must go on. The worker gravitates steadily everywhere to a bare subsistence. The rest of the proceeds of his labour swell the power of the owners. So it will go on, while gain and getting are the rule of your system, until accumulated tensions between class and class smash this present social organisation and inaugurate a new age. In considering the thought and work of Karl Marx, the reader must bear in mind the epoch in which that work commenced. The intellectual world was then under the sway of an organized mass of ideas known as the science of political economy, a mass of ideas that has now not so much been examined and refuted as slipped away imperceptibly from its hold upon the minds of men. In the beginning, in the hands of Adam Smith, whose richly suggestive book is now all too little read, political economy was a broad-minded and sane inquiry into the statecraft of trade based upon current assumptions of private ownership and personal motives. But from him it passed to men of perhaps, in some cases, quite equal intellectual energy but inferior vision and range. The history of political economy is indeed one of the most striking instances of the mischief wrought by intellectual minds devoid of vision in the entire history of human thought. Special definition, technicality are the stigmata of second-rate intellectual men. They cannot work with the universal tool, they cannot appeal to the general mind. They must abstract and separate. On such men fell the giant's robe of Adam Smith, and they wore it after their manner. Their arid atmospheres are intolerant of clouds. An outline that is not harsh is abominable to them. They criticized their master's vagueness, and must needs mend it. They sought to give political economy a precision and conviction such a subject will not stand. They took such words as value, an incurably and necessarily vague word; rent, the name of the specific relation of landlord and tenant;